Welcome back, everyone, and if you're new here, welcome. Today we're embarking on something truly special. We're going to travel back thousands of years, through the dust and silence of the ancient world, to sit with some of the most remarkable objects ever discovered by human hands, artifacts that reach out across the millennia and connect us to the world of the Bible in ways that are quite simply breathtaking. From clay tablets and crumbling scrolls, to carved stone inscriptions and tiny silver amulets worn around the necks of people who lived and loved and feared, just like us, each one of these ancient treasures has a story to tell. This is part one of a two-part journey, so make sure you stay tuned for part two, where we continue exploring even more of these incredible windows into the ancient biblical world. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more people find this content, and it means the world to this community we're building together. Now, let's step back in time. The world of the scribes. Somewhere in the dry, golden hills above the Dead Sea, sometime around the year 100 BC, a young scribe dipped a reed pen into a clay inkwell and began to write. He did not know, as his hand moved carefully across a long sheet of parchment, that what he was producing would survive more than 2,000 years. He did not know that it would be hidden, forgotten, rediscovered by a Bedouin shepherd boy, and would one day be called one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. He was simply doing his work, in the way his teachers had taught him, in the way their teachers had taught them, passing the words forward through time like a flame passed carefully between hands in the dark. The Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is our first fact, are a collection of approximately 981 manuscripts discovered between 1947 and 1956 in 11 caves near the site of Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. That discovery, which began when a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ad-Dib tossed a stone into a cave and heard the sound of breaking pottery, opened a window onto the ancient Jewish world that scholars had never dared hope to find. The scrolls are written primarily in Hebrew, with significant portions in Aramaic and a smaller number in Greek, three languages that together paint a picture of a world far more complex and multilingual than many had imagined. The parchment they are written on is made from animal skin, carefully prepared and smoothed, and in many cases preserved almost miraculously by the extreme dryness of the desert air. The oldest of the scrolls date to the 3rd century BCE, making some of them over 2,300 years old, older than the Roman Empire at its height, older than the Colosseum, older than the birth of Julius Caesar. Among the scrolls are copies of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, with the notable exception of the Book of Esther. The Great Isaiah Scroll, discovered in Cave 1 in 1947, is the oldest complete manuscript of any book of the Bible ever found, and it is remarkably similar to the text of Isaiah as it appears in modern Bibles, a testament to the extraordinary care with which these ancient texts were copied and preserved across the centuries. When scholars unrolled that scroll and compared it to the text they already knew, the consistency they found across more than 1,000 years of copying was quietly astonishing. But the scrolls are not only biblical texts. They also include what are called sectarian writings, documents produced by the community that lived at Qumran itself, a group of devout Jewish men who had withdrawn from Jerusalem to live a life of strict religious discipline in the desert. These documents include community rules, hymns, commentaries on biblical texts, and a haunting and elaborate document known as the War Scroll, which describes a final cosmic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Reading it, even in translation, across 2,000 years of distance, you can feel the intensity of the world that produced it, a world of deep conviction, of longing, of a community that believed it was living at the edge of the age. The jars in which many of the scrolls were stored deserve a moment of quiet attention. They are tall, narrow, cylindrical clay vessels with lids, simple and functional, made to preserve. Whoever placed those scrolls in those jars and carried them into those caves did so with intention. They were hiding something they considered precious. They may have been fleeing the Roman advance that would destroy Jerusalem in 70 CE. They may have intended to come back. They never did. And so the jars sat in the dark, in the dry silence of the Judean wilderness, holding their contents safe across 2 millennia, waiting for a stone thrown by a boy who is looking for a lost goat. Stones that speak. From the soft parchment of the scrolls, our journey carries us now to something harder and more permanent, stone, and the extraordinary messages carved into it by people who wanted their words to last. The Mesha stele, sometimes called the Moabite stone, is a black basalt slab standing about a meter tall, discovered in 1868 in the ancient region of Moab, in what is now the country of Jordan. It is inscribed with 34 lines of text written in the Moabite language, and it was commissioned by a king named Mesha to celebrate his victories over Israel in the 9th century BC. What makes this stone extraordinary is that it contains one of the earliest known inscriptions mentioning the name of the God of Israel, written not by an Israelite, but by one of Israel's enemies, as part of a boast about defeating them. The same events described on the Mesha stele appear in the second book of Kings in the Bible, and the correlation between the two accounts, one carved in stone by a Moabite king, one preserved in scripture, sends a quiet thrill through anyone who studies the ancient world. Two sources, separated by thousands of years of transmission, describing the same conflict from opposite sides. The stone was found in pieces. It had been deliberately broken apart at some point after its discovery, possibly by local villagers who believed that breaking it and distributing the fragments would bring them good fortune, or possibly to make it easier to sell. Many of the pieces were reassembled, and a squeeze, a paper impression taken before the break, helped scholars reconstruct the missing sections. Today the stele sits in the Louvre in Paris, patient and dark and very old, its inscription still as sharp as the day it was carved. Not far away in historical terms, though separated by geography and culture, the Tel Dan Stele tells another remarkable story. Discovered in fragments at the site of ancient Dan in northern Israel in 1993 and 1994, this stele is written in Aramaic and contains what many scholars consider the first reference outside the Bible to the House of David, the royal dynasty founded by the biblical king whose name has echoed through 3,000 years of religious tradition. The phrase, House of David, appears in a list of enemies defeated by an Aramean king, and its presence on stone, physical, datable, indisputable, sent a ripple of excitement through the archaeological world when it was first announced. Here, in basalt fragments from a dig site in northern Israel, was extra-biblical evidence for a figure whose historical existence some scholars had questioned. The stone had been waiting in the earth for nearly 3,000 years to make its point. Clay and memory. If stone is the medium of kings and monuments, clay is the medium of everyday life, and nowhere is this more vividly illustrated than in the extraordinary archive of clay tablets discovered at sites across the ancient Near East. The Amarna letters are a collection of clay tablets discovered in 1887 in Egypt, at the site of the ancient city of Akhetaten, built by the pharaoh Akhenaten. There are 382 of them, and they are written in cuneiform, a script pressed into wet clay with a wedge-shaped stylus, in the Akkadian language, which served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient world, the way French once served in European diplomacy. The tablets are letters, diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian pharaoh and the kings and governors of city-states across Canaan and the wider Near East, dating to approximately the 14th century BCE. Reading them, or rather, reading translations of them, is a quietly extraordinary experience, because they are so human. Kings complain about not receiving enough gold. Governors beg for military assistance. Ambassadors describe insults they have suffered. One letter, from a Canaanite king named Abdi-Heba, governor of a city called Jerusalem, which we know today as Jerusalem, pleads desperately for Egyptian troops to help defend his city against raiders he calls the Habaru. Whether the Habaru of the Amarna letters have any connection to the biblical Hebrews is debated. But the name of Jerusalem, carved in clay by a governor writing to a pharaoh more than 3,000 years ago, is there to be read. The clay tablets of Nuzi, discovered in modern Iraq, contain adoption contracts, marriage agreements, and property records from the 15th century BCE, and they illuminate social customs that bear striking similarities to practices described in the book of Genesis. The practice of a barren wife offering her servant to her husband as a surrogate, as Sarah did with Hagar and Rachel with Bilhah, appears in these tablets as a recognized legal custom of the ancient Near East. These are not proof of the biblical narratives, but they are something almost as valuable. They are context. They place the stories in a world that is recognizable, consistent, human. They remind us that the people who appear in these ancient texts were not living in a mythological landscape, but in a real one, governed by real laws, complicated by real relationships, shaped by the same hopes and frustrations that have always characterized human life. The seals of the ancient world. Among the smallest and yet most personal of all ancient artifacts are the seals, tiny carved objects, sometimes no larger than a thumbnail, pressed into wet clay to leave an impression that served as a signature, a mark of ownership, an authentication. In a world before widespread literacy, a seal was identity made portable and permanent. Hundreds of ancient Hebrew seals have been discovered across Israel and the surrounding regions, many of them bearing names that appear in the pages of the Old Testament. One of the most celebrated is the seal of Baruch son of Neriah, a clay impression called a bulla, measuring barely 1.7 centimeters across, discovered in the antiquities market in the 1970s. Baruch son of Neriah was the scribe and close companion of the prophet Jeremiah, and he is mentioned by name multiple times in the book of Jeremiah. His bulla reads, in ancient Hebrew script, belonging to Berechiahu's son of Neriah the scribe. Berechiahu and Baruch are forms of the same name. Neriah and Neriah are forms of the same name. A fingerprint was found on the back of the bulla, pressed there, perhaps by Baruch himself, more than 2,600 years ago, at the moment he sealed a document in the court of the king. If that identification is correct, that fingerprint is the closest any physical artifact has ever come to being a personal trace left by a named figure from the biblical text. The seal of Gemariah, son of Shaphan, another figure mentioned by name in the book of Jeremiah, was discovered in a controlled excavation in the city of David in Jerusalem, giving it an unimpeachable archaeological provenance. The seal of Jezebel, the Phoenician queen whose story is told with such dramatic intensity in the Book of Kings, has been tentatively identified among the artifacts of the ancient world, though its attribution remains debated. These tiny objects, pressed into clay in moments of bureaucratic routine, in the signing of contracts and the sealing of letters, have survived the destruction of the kingdoms they belong to, the burning of the palaces they circulated in, the silence of millennia, to arrive in our hands and speak their small, precise, astonishing testimony. The Siloam Tunnel and the waters beneath Jerusalem. Beneath the streets of the modern city of Jerusalem, carved through solid limestone by workers who labored in the dark with iron tools, there runs a tunnel more than 500 meters long, cut sometime in the late 8th century BC during the reign of the Judean king Hezekiah. The tunnel carried water from the Gin spring, outside the city walls, to the pool of Siloam, inside the walls. A feat of engineering designed to secure Jerusalem's water supply in the event of a siege. The project is described in the second book of Chronicles. It was Hezekiah who blocked the upper outlet of the waters of Gin and channeled them down to the west side of the city of David. The tunnel itself can be walked today by visitors who wade through water up to their knees in the dark beneath the old city. Following the same path the water has followed for nearly 3,000 years. In 1880, a young boy playing in the waters near the tunnel's exit discovered an inscription carved into the tunnel wall approximately 6 meters from the Siloam end. The Siloam inscription, as it came to be known, describes in beautiful, literary Hebrew the moment when the two teams of workers, tunneling from opposite ends, broke through to meet each other in the middle. The text describes how the workers could hear each other's voices and the sound of their picks through the rock before the final breakthrough, and the joy of that moment of connection in the dark. It is one of the oldest pieces of Hebrew prose ever discovered, and it reads not like a royal decree or a religious formula, but like a human story, the story of workers who had done something difficult and were proud of it, and wanted to say so in stone. The inscription was removed from the tunnel wall in 1890 and is now held in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. But the tunnel remains, and the water still moves through it, and the stone still holds the shape of the tools that cut it 27 centuries ago. The ark, the tabernacle, and the objects of the temple. There are artifacts in the biblical world that have never been found, whose absence is itself a kind of presence, whose mystery has outlasted every empire that rose and fell in the ancient Near East. Chief among them is the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark is described in the book of Exodus with a precision that suggests the account of someone who had either seen it or was drawing on a detailed tradition of what it looked like. It was a chest made of acacia wood, overlaid inside and out with pure gold, measuring approximately 1.1 meters long, 0.7 meters wide, and 0.7 meters tall. It was carried on gold-covered poles inserted through rings at its four corners, so that those who bore it would not touch it directly. Its lid, called the mercy seat or capret, was fashioned from solid gold, and two cherubim of hammered gold faced each other above it, their wings spread upward and inward, sheltering the space above the lid. Within the ark, according to the biblical text, were placed the 2 stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna from the wilderness, and Aaron's rod that had budded. The ark was kept in the innermost sanctuary of the temple in Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies, a room entered only once a year by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. When the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple in 587 BCE, the ark disappears from the historical record. It is not listed among the temple treasures carried to Babylon. It is not mentioned in any account of the temple's destruction. It simply ceases to appear. Where it went, whether it was destroyed, hidden, carried away to an unknown location, or whether its disappearance reflects something more complex in the history of the text, remains one of the ancient world's most enduring mysteries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims to possess it in a chapel in the city of Aksum, where it is said to be guarded by a single monk who never leaves the sanctuary. No independent verification has ever been permitted. The mystery holds, as it has always held, patient and complete. What has survived from the temple tradition, however, is remarkable. The copper scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but unlike any other, inscribed not on parchment but on thin sheets of copper, contains a list of 64 locations where vast quantities of gold, silver, and temple treasures are said to have been hidden. Whether the scroll describes real hidden treasure or is a literary or religious document remains debated. But the specificity of its directions, in the cistern that is below the rampart on the east side, in a place hollowed out of the rock, 600 talents of silver, has the quality of a genuine inventory, and it has inspired treasure hunters and scholars alike for more than 70 years. Pottery, pilgrims, and the everyday sacred. Not all of the artifacts that illuminate the biblical world are grand or mysterious. Some of the most revealing are the most ordinary: the broken pottery, the oil lamps, the storage jars and cooking vessels that accumulate in the soil of every inhabited site and speak, in their quiet way, of daily life. Pottery is the archaeologist's closest companion and most reliable witness. Because ceramic styles changed over time in consistent and well-documented ways, a fragment of pottery, even a tiny sherd with no inscription, no decoration, no obvious significance, can date the layer of soil in which it was found to within a century or less. The pottery of ancient Israel tells the story of trade routes and cultural contact. Cypriot pottery found in Canaanite sites, Aegean storage jars in Bronze Age ports, imported goods mixed with local wares in the houses of merchants who lived and died 3,000 years ago. A storage jar handle stamped with a royal seal, the Lamech, meaning belonging to the king. Jars found at sites across Judah and dating to the reign of Hezekiah, suggests a system of centralized royal administration, a bureaucratic infrastructure that the biblical texts describe, but that these clay handles make tangible and real. Oil lamps are among the most intimate of ancient artifacts. They were filled with olive oil and lit with a linen wick, and they were carried through the rooms of houses, placed in niches and walls, set beside beds in the night. Thousands of them have been found in the soil of ancient Israel, in every shape characteristic of their period. The simple saucer lamps of the early Bronze Age, the pinch spout lamps of the Middle Bronze, the graceful wheel-thrown lamps of the Iron Age, the elaborate molded lamps of the Roman period. When Jesus spoke, in the Gospel of Matthew, of a woman who lights a lamp and sweeps the whole house searching for a lost coin, He was describing something his listeners knew in their bones: the guttering light of an oil lamp in a dark room, the urgency of a small loss that matters enormously. Those lamps, held in 1,000 excavated hands, make the parable immediate in a way that words alone cannot quite achieve. The Pilate Stone and the world of the New Testament. Our journey carries us now from the Hebrew Bible into the world of the New Testament, a world that, for all its familiarity, continues to yield archaeological surprises that illuminate its stories in new and unexpected ways. In 1961, Italian archaeologists excavating the ancient Roman theater at Caesarea Maritima, the grand port city built by Herod the Great on the Mediterranean coast of Israel, uncovered a limestone block that had been reused as a step. When they turned it over, they found a partial inscription in Latin, damaged but legible enough to be read. The inscription contains the name Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea before whom, according to all four Gospels, Jesus was brought for judgment, and the name Tiberium, suggesting that Pilate had dedicated a building to the Emperor Tiberius. This was the first archaeological confirmation that Pontius Pilate was a real historical figure. Before the discovery of the Pilate Stone, as it came to be called, Pilate was attested in historical sources, in the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus, but not in any physical inscription. The stone, now displayed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, makes his existence concrete in a way that no text, however reliable, quite can. He walked the streets of Caesarea. He dedicated buildings. He left his name in stone, and the stone waited 2,000 years to be found. The world of Herod the Great, the king whose paranoia, ambition, and extraordinary building projects fill so many pages of the New Testament's background history, is illuminated by archaeology in remarkable detail. Herod was one of the ancient world's most prolific builders. He rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem on a scale of breathtaking grandeur, constructed the port of Caesarea Maritima from scratch on an inhospitable stretch of coastline, built the fortress palace of Masada on a sheer rock plateau above the Dead Sea, and created the artificial mountain of Herodium as his intended burial place. The Temple Mount retaining walls he constructed, of which the western wall, sacred to Jewish prayer, is the most famous remaining section, were built from limestone blocks of staggering size, some weighing over 500 tons. Standing at the base of those walls and looking up, you can feel the ambition of the man who built them, the will that moved those stones into place, the world that produced a ruler of such restless, extravagant, and ultimately tragic energy. In 2007, the tomb of Herod the Great was identified at Herodium by the Israeli archaeologist Ehud Netzer, who had spent 3 decades searching for it. The sarcophagus was found smashed, deliberately, it appears, perhaps by the Jewish rebels who occupied Herodium during the revolt against Rome that followed Herod's death. The man who had rebuilt the temple lay in a broken tomb on the hill he had built for himself, his burial place destroyed by the people over whom he had ruled. History, in such moments, has a kind of quiet, implacable poetry. The Ossuary of James. In 2002, an ancient limestone ossuary, a bone box used to store the bones of the dead after the flesh had decomposed, appeared on the antiquities market in Israel. It was an ordinary ossuary in size and shape, but carved into its side was an Aramaic inscription that, if authentic, would make it one of the most significant biblical artifacts ever found. The inscription reads, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. In Aramaic, Yaakov bar Yosef Akoid Yeshua. The ossuary became one of the most debated artifacts in modern archaeology. The Israel Antiquities Authority convened a committee that concluded the inscription was a forgery, specifically that the second part of the inscription, brother of Jesus, had been added later to an originally genuine ossuary. The owner of the ossuary was tried in Israeli court on forgery charges. After a trial that lasted years and produced hundreds of pages of expert testimony, he was acquitted, not because the inscription was proven authentic, but because the prosecution could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had forged it. The debate continues. Some of the world's most respected epigraphers, scholars who study ancient inscriptions, argue that the inscription is genuine. Others maintain that it is a forgery. The ossuary itself sits at the center of this disagreement, patient and limestone gray, neither confirming nor denying, holding its secret the way stone holds everything, in silence across time. Parchment, papyrus, and the transmission of the word. As we draw toward the close of our journey, let us return to where we began, to the scribes, and to the extraordinary story of how the texts of the Bible were preserved, copied, and transmitted across the millennia. The Nash papyrus, acquired in Egypt in 1902 and now held at Cambridge University, was for decades the oldest known fragment of biblical text in Hebrew. It dates to approximately the 2nd or 1st century BCE and contains the Ten Commandments and the Shema, the great declaration of monotheism from the book of Deuteronomy. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the Nash papyrus lost its claim to being the oldest, but it remains a beautiful and historically significant object, a fragment of papyrus, fragile as a pressed flower, carrying words that hundreds of millions of people across 3 millennia have considered sacred. The Codex Sinaiticus is one of the oldest and most complete manuscripts of the Christian Bible in existence. It was written in Greek, on vellum made from animal skin, in the 4th century CE, the same century in which the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and transformed the religion's relationship to power. The Codex was discovered in 1844 by the German scholar Constantin von Tischendorf at the monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai Peninsula, one of the oldest continuously inhabited Christian monasteries in the world. Nestled at the foot of the mountain traditionally identified as the Mount Sinai of the Exodus. The story of how Tischendorf came to possess the manuscript, involving multiple visits, disputed agreements with the monastery, and a controversy about whether the manuscript was given, loaned, or effectively taken, is itself a long and complicated chapter in the history of biblical scholarship. Today, the Codex Sinaiticus is held in 4 locations: the British Library in London, the Leipzig University Library, the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg, and the monastery where it was found. It has been digitized and is available in its entirety online, and you can read it, all of it, every page, every line of 4th century Greek script, from wherever you are in the world, at any hour of the day or night. The scribe who spent months or years copying those letters onto vellum in the 4th century could not have imagined such a thing. And yet there the words are, traveling through time in ways that no one who first wrote them could have foreseen. The Tel Megiddo Ivories. There is a city that sits at the edge of a great valley in northern Israel, a city so strategically positioned, so fought over across so many centuries, that its very name became synonymous with final, decisive conflict. The city is Megiddo, and it has been inhabited, destroyed, rebuilt, and inhabited again so many times that the accumulated layers of its history rise from the surrounding plain in a great artificial mound, a tell, that archaeologists have been carefully excavating since the early 20th century. From the ruins of its Bronze Age palace, from the debris of a destruction that occurred sometime around 1150 BCE, came one of the most exquisite collections of ancient decorative art ever discovered in the region, the Megiddo Ivories. There are more than 380 of them, carved plaques, inlaid panels, decorated boxes, figurines, and game boards, all fashioned from elephant ivory and discovered in what appears to have been a treasury room of the palace. They had been stored together, perhaps waiting to be worked into furniture or decorative panels, when the palace was destroyed and the roof collapsed over them, preserving them in the debris for 3,000 years. The craftsmanship is breathtaking. Sphinxes and lions, hunting scenes and ritual processions, a lion attacking a bull, a ruler seated on a throne flanked by cherubim, the same winged figures that appear in the biblical description of Solomon's throne and the Ark of the Covenant. One panel shows a procession of captives being led before a seated king who drinks from a bowl while a musician plays a lute. Another shows a hero figure, nude and powerful, grasping two animals by the throat in a pose that appears across the ancient Near East from Egypt to Mesopotamia. The ivories were almost certainly luxury goods, imports, or the work of craftsmen trained in Phoenician or Egyptian artistic traditions, and they speak of a palace culture that was cosmopolitan, wealthy, and deeply embedded in the broader artistic world of the ancient Near East. When the Book of Kings describes the ivory palace built by Ahab, king of Israel, or when the prophet Amos rails against the houses of ivory of the wealthy elite, these carvings are the physical reality behind those words. The luxury that the prophets condemned, the beauty that the palace culture produced, it is all here, in these small and extraordinary objects, waiting in the soil of Megiddo across 30 centuries to be lifted into the light. The Gezer Calendar. It is a small limestone tablet, roughly the size of a man's hand, found in 1908 by the Irish archaeologist Arius McAllister during his excavations at the ancient Canaanite and Israelite city of Gezer. It is inscribed with 7 lines of early Hebrew text, and it dates to approximately the 10th century BCE, the era of the early Israelite monarchy, the time of Solomon, and the generation that followed David. It is not a royal inscription. It is not a religious text. It is, as far as scholars can determine, a simple agricultural calendar, a list of the farming seasons and the tasks associated with each, written in a plain, unpretentious hand that some have suggested belonged to a student practicing his letters. The Gezer calendar reads something like this: 2 months of harvest, 2 months of planting, 2 months of late planting, a month of hoeing flax, a month of harvesting barley, a month of harvesting and measuring grain, 2 months of grape tending, a month of summer fruit. It is a year in the life of an ancient Israelite farmer, compressed into 7 lines of limestone. And it is one of the oldest known examples of Hebrew writing ever found. What moves something in the chest when you read about this small tablet is its ordinariness. It was not carved to commemorate a battle or a king. It was not inscribed to declare the power of a god. It was written, in all likelihood, by someone learning to write, practicing the letters of the alphabet, giving them meaning by anchoring them to the rhythms of work and season that organized every life in the ancient agricultural world. The same rhythms that appear in the Book of Ruth, where the story unfolds against the backdrop of the barley harvest and the threshing floor. The same rhythms that pulse beneath the poetry of the Psalms, in their images of grain and harvest and the fatness of the earth. The Gezer calendar is not a great artifact in the way that the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Ark of the Covenant are great. It is great in the way that an ordinary life, lived with care and attention, is great, quietly, completely, and without any expectation of being remembered. The Lachish Letters. In the summer of 588 BC, the Babylonian army of Nebuchadnezzar was moving through the southern kingdom of Judah like a slow and terrible tide, taking city after city, leaving destruction behind it. Jerusalem, the capital, was under siege. And in the military garrison of the city of Lachish, the second most important city in Judah, a heavily fortified stronghold guarding the approach to Jerusalem from the southwest, a soldier or officer was writing letters on pieces of broken pottery called ostraca, using ink made from carbon black and a fine brush. 18 of these letters were discovered in 1935 and 1938 in the ruins of the Lachish Gate complex, buried in the ash layer of the city's destruction. They are military correspondence, reports sent between officers in the field and the garrison commander at Lachish, and they read with an urgency and attention that the distance of 2,600 years does not fully muffle. One letter, known as Lachish Letter 4, contains a line that has sent a quiet shock through biblical scholarship since it was first translated. "We are watching for the fire signals of Lachish, according to all the signs which my Lord has given, because we cannot see Azekah." Azekah was another fortified city nearby. The fire signals, beacons used to communicate between garrison towns, were no longer visible from Azekah, which meant almost certainly that Azekah had fallen. The writer of the letter could no longer see his neighboring city's fire signal. He was watching for Lachish, and Lachish itself would soon fall. This letter casts a precise and devastating light on a passage in the book of Jeremiah, which notes that at the time of the Babylonian advance, only Lachish and Azekah remained of the fortified cities of Judah. The ostracon and the scripture describe the same shrinking perimeter, the same closing darkness, from positions only miles apart. The soldier who wrote that letter did not know he was illuminating a biblical text. He was simply reporting what he could see, or rather, what he could no longer see from his watchtower in the last days of a kingdom. The Ketef Hinnom Silver Scrolls. In 1979, a young archaeology student named Gabriel Barkey was excavating a series of rock-cut tombs on a ridge called Ketef Hinnom, Shoulder of Hinnom, just southwest of the old city of Jerusalem, overlooking the valley that the Bible associates with the fires of Molech and the darkness of Gehenna. The tombs had been looted in antiquity, and Barkey was not expecting major finds. But in one small repository chamber, where the bones of the dead had been swept aside over centuries of reuse, his team found an extraordinary concentration of burial goods, pottery, arrowheads, bone and ivory objects, and hundreds of tiny silver pieces. Among those silver pieces were 2 small cylinders, tightly rolled, that had been worn as amulets, suspended from a string around the neck of someone who had died and been buried in that tomb sometime in the late 7th or early 6th century BC. When they were finally unrolled, with painstaking care, in a laboratory at the Israel Museum, they were found to bear inscriptions, tiny, careful, ancient Hebrew letters pressed into the thin silver. The inscriptions contain a version of the priestly blessing from the Book of Numbers. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. These 2 silver amulets are the oldest known texts from the Hebrew Bible ever discovered. They predate the Dead Sea Scrolls by 4 centuries. They predate the destruction of the First Temple, which the Bible describes as occurring in 587 BC, which means they were made during a time when the temple still stood, when its priesthood still functioned, when those words were still being spoken in the rituals of a living religious community. Someone wore those words around their neck in the last years before the world they knew was destroyed. Someone chose that particular blessing of protection, of grace, of peace, to carry close to their body in a time of danger. The silver is thin and ancient and extraordinary. The words are unchanged. The Elephantine Papyri. On a small island in the Nile River in southern Egypt, an island called Elephantine, known in antiquity as Yeb, there existed, in the 5th century BC, a Jewish military colony. These were Jews living in Egypt, serving as soldiers in the Persian army that then governed Egypt, maintaining their own community with a temple to their god, corresponding in Aramaic with authorities in Jerusalem and Samaria, and writing letters and legal documents on papyrus that would survive, buried in the dry Egyptian soil. Until their discovery in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Elephantine Papyri, as this collection came to be known, number in the hundreds and contain a remarkable range of documents, marriage contracts and divorce agreements, property deeds and loan records, letters of petition to Persian governors, and correspondence about the community's temple, which had been destroyed by Egyptian priests who resented its presence and was later rebuilt with Persian permission. There are documents in which women appear as independent legal actors, buying and selling property, initiating divorce, and engaging in business transactions, a picture of Jewish women's legal status in the ancient world that is richer and more complex than many had assumed. One of the most significant documents is a letter from the Jewish community at Elephantine to the governor of Judah, asking for permission and support to rebuild their destroyed temple. The letter mentions by name the sons of Sanballat, governor of Samaria, and Sanballat is a figure who appears prominently in the book of Nehemiah as an opponent of Nehemiah's project to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. The Elephantine letter dates to approximately 407 BC, and Sanballat's sons are described as already governing in their father's place, consistent with Nehemiah's account of events a few decades earlier. Here, in letters written by Jewish soldiers on a Nile island, are the names and the administrative structures that the biblical text describes, rendered in ink on papyrus in the same generation that knew them. The Pool of Siloam. We have already visited the tunnel that carries water to it, but the Pool of Siloam itself, the destination of those waters, the reservoir within the walls of Jerusalem to which Hezekiah's engineering directed the Gin spring, deserves its own moment of attention. For centuries, the traditional location of the Pool of Siloam was identified with a small Byzantine-era pool at the end of the tunnel, built in the 5th century CE over what pilgrims believed was the original site. But in 2004, during infrastructure repair work in the city of David, workers accidentally uncovered stone steps, broad, carefully cut stone steps leading down to a large open area that turned out to be the original 1st century CE Pool of Siloam. The pool that was uncovered is large, far larger than the Byzantine pool that had long been shown to visitors and pilgrims. It dates to the Hasmonean period and was expanded and renovated in the time of Herod the Great, and it is the pool that appears in the Gospel of John, chapter 9, where Jesus tells a man born blind to go and wash in the Pool of Siloam. The man goes, washes, and returns seeing. The pool where that account is set, whatever one makes of the account itself, has been found. The stone steps that thousands of pilgrims and ordinary Jerusalemites would have descended to reach the water are there, still in the earth, still holding their shape against the weight of the centuries above them. What is perhaps most striking about the discovery of the Pool of Siloam is how it fits into the larger picture of 1st century Jerusalem that archaeology has been slowly and carefully assembling over the past century. The pool lay at the southern end of a major street, the Pilgrimage Road, that led northward through the city toward the Temple Mount. Thousands of Jewish pilgrims would have walked that road during the great festivals of the year, ascending from the pool toward the temple, their feet on the same paving stones that 1st century feet wore smooth. Excavations of the Pilgrimage Road, still ongoing in recent years, have found coins, pottery, and stone vessels consistent with the 1st century CE, the period in which the Gospels are set, scattered in the fill beneath the paving stones and in the drainage channel that runs beneath the road. The city the New Testament describes is emerging from the soil, stone by stone and sherd by sherd, into the light of the present day. The Nag Hammadi Library. In December of 1945, just 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, 2 brothers were digging for fertilizer near the base of a cliff at a place called Jabal al-Tarif, close to the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. Their mattocks struck something hard in the soil, a large sealed clay jar, about 60 centimeters tall. They hesitated before opening it. There was a local belief that such jars might contain a jinn, a spirit, and it was not wise to disturb them carelessly. But the hope that the jar might contain gold eventually overcame their caution, and they broke it open. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices, ancient books, wrapped in leather and preserved by the dryness of the Egyptian climate. They contained no gold. What they contained was something scholars would argue was worth considerably more. The Nag Hammadi Library, as these codices came to be known, contains 52 texts written in Coptic, the late form of the ancient Egyptian language, and dating to approximately the 4th century CE, though most are believed to be translations of earlier Greek originals. They are Gnostic texts, writings from a diverse and complex tradition of early Christianity that emphasize secret knowledge, the spark of the divine within the individual, and a cosmology very different from what would become Orthodox Christian doctrine. Among them is the Gospel of Thomas, which presents itself as a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus, some of which are very similar to sayings found in the canonical Gospels, and some of which are strikingly different or found nowhere else in ancient literature. The Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John. These are texts that were known by name from the writings of early church fathers who condemned them, but whose actual contents were lost for nearly 16 centuries. Until two brothers digging for fertilizer in a field in Egypt broke open a clay jar and changed the landscape of early Christian studies forever. The story of what happened to the codices after their discovery is almost as dramatic as the discovery itself. One codex was burned by the brothers' mother for reasons that remain unclear. Others were sold on the antiquities market, passed through the hands of dealers in Cairo, and eventually attracted the attention of scholars. A French scholar recognized the significance of one codex at the Jung Institute in Zurich. The Egyptian government eventually secured most of the collection, and the texts were photographed, translated, and published over the following decades. They are now held at the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where they sit in their ancient leather bindings and continue to generate scholarship, debate, and wonder. A library that was buried in the Egyptian desert around the same time that the Roman Empire was making Christianity its official religion, and that lay in the dark all through the centuries of Christendom's rise and flourishing, waiting to be found. The Rosetta Stone and the recovery of ancient languages. To understand the artifacts of the biblical world, to read the inscriptions on the Mesha stele, to decipher the Amarna letters, to translate the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars first had to recover the ancient languages in which they were written. And the story of how one of those languages was recovered is among the most dramatic in the history of human knowledge. The Rosetta Stone is a granodiorite stele discovered by French soldiers during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign in 1799, near the town of Rosetta, Rashid, in the Nile Delta. It bears the same priestly decree, issued in 196 BCE during the reign of Ptolemy V, inscribed in 3 scripts: ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, Demotic script, and ancient Greek. Because Greek was already understood by European scholars, the stone offered, in principle, a key to deciphering the hieroglyphic writing system that had been unreadable since the 4th century CE, a silence of nearly 1,500 years. The decipherment was not quick or easy. It occupied the best minds in European scholarship for more than 2 decades. The Englishman Thomas Young made significant early progress, correctly identifying that the oval cartouches in hieroglyphic inscriptions contained royal names. But it was the French scholar Jean-François Champollion who, in 1822, achieved the breakthrough that unlocked the system, recognizing that hieroglyphics were not, as had long been assumed, purely symbolic, but a complex writing system that combined phonetic and semantic elements. When Champollion made his final realization, on September 14, 1822, he reportedly burst into his brother's office shouting, "Je pense le faire. I have got it," and then fainted from excitement. He did not regain full health for 5 days. The recovery of the ability to read hieroglyphics opened 3,000 years of Egyptian history, literature, and religious thought to modern understanding, and it transformed, in turn, our ability to understand the world in which the biblical narratives were set. The Megiddo Seal of Shema. Among the most beautiful of all ancient Hebrew seals is one that was found not on the antiquities market, but in a controlled excavation, discovered at Megiddo in 1904 by the German scholar Gottlieb Schumacher and recognized immediately as something exceptional. It is a jasper seal, deep green with red flecks, carved in the shape of a crouching lion with extraordinary naturalistic skill. Beneath the lion, in clear ancient Hebrew script, runs the inscription, belonging to Shema, servant of Jeroboam. The Jeroboam in question is believed to be Jeroboam II, who reigned as king of Israel in the 8th century BCE, one of the longest reigning and most politically successful of the northern kingdom's monarchs, whose reign is described in the second book of Kings. Shema was almost certainly a high official in his court. The word servant, in this context, denotes not a slave but a royal administrator, a man of significant power and standing. His seal, pressed into the clay of documents and storage jars, was the mark of that authority. The seal is now lost. It was given as a gift to the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II after its discovery, and its subsequent whereabouts are unknown. What survives is a plaster cast made at the time, and photographs, and the memory of those who saw it. In a field full of artifacts whose physical presence is their most powerful quality, whose stone or clay or parchment carries a weight that images cannot fully convey, the loss of the Shema seal is felt as a particular absence. The lion that crouched so beautifully on that deep green jasper, the name of the man who owned it, the king he served, all of that is present in the cast and the photographs, but the original, the thing itself, is gone. It is a reminder that the survival of ancient artifacts is never inevitable, never guaranteed, always a matter of chance and circumstance and the particular accidents of history. Most of what was made in the ancient world is gone. What survives is a fragment of a fragment, and every fragment that does survive carries, in its survival, something close to a miracle. The Shroud of Turin. We close our journey with perhaps the most debated, most studied, most contested artifact in the entire history of Christianity. A length of linen cloth, approximately 4.4 meters long and 1.1 meters wide, kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, and bearing the faint but unmistakable image of a man. The image shows the front and back of a human figure, bearded, long-haired, with wounds consistent with crucifixion visible at the wrists and feet, and marks consistent with a crown of thorns around the head. It is called the Shroud of Turin, and for centuries it has been venerated by many Christians as the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, the cloth in which his body was wrapped in the tomb, and on which, somehow, his image was impressed. The scientific debate about the shroud is extensive, technical, and unresolved. In 1988, radiocarbon dating performed by 3 independent laboratories on a small sample of the cloth returned dates consistent with the medieval period, between 1260 and 1390 CE. For many scientists, this settled the question. The shroud was a medieval artifact, not a first-century one. But the debate did not end there. Critics of the radiocarbon dating have pointed to evidence that the sample used may have been taken from a portion of the cloth that was repaired or rewoven in the medieval period, potentially skewing the date. Other researchers have argued that the image itself, the mechanism by which a 3-dimensional human form was transferred onto a 2-dimensional cloth surface in a manner that is not fully explained by any known medieval artistic technique, represents a genuine scientific mystery that has not yet been resolved. The shroud has been subjected to more scientific testing than any other artifact in human history. Its blood stains have been typed. Its pollen has been analyzed. Its weave has been examined. The three-dimensional information encoded in its image has been extracted by computer. None of this has produced consensus. The shroud remains, as it has always remained, a mystery, an object that refuses to yield the one thing everyone wants from it, which is certainty. And perhaps that is fitting. The artifacts of the ancient biblical world have shown us, across this long and gentle journey, that the past does not give up its secrets cleanly or completely. It gives them up in fragments, in the fingerprint on a clay seal, in the fire signal that cannot be seen, in the silver amulet worn around the neck of someone long gone, in the letter from a garrison town in the last days of a kingdom. The past speaks to us in the language of things, and things are always partial, always ambiguous, always open to interpretation. That ambiguity is not a frustration. It is an invitation to stay curious, to stay humble, to keep returning to the evidence with fresh eyes and an open mind, the way we return, night after night, to the quiet and the dark, and find that there is always more waiting there than we remembered. The Cyrus Cylinder. Somewhere in the ruins of ancient Babylon, in the soil of what is now modern Iraq, beneath a sky that has watched empires rise and fall with the patience that only sky can manage, there lay, for more than 2,000 years, a small clay cylinder about 23 centimeters long. It was baked hard in the fires of antiquity, inscribed in cuneiform script with 45 lines of Akkadian text, and it was placed in the foundations of a wall sometime around 539 BCE by order of the Persian king Cyrus the Great, who had just conquered Babylon without a battle and wished to leave behind a record of his intentions toward the people he now governed. The Cyrus cylinder was discovered in 1879 by the Assyrian-British archaeologist Hormuzd Ras Sam during excavations sponsored by the British Museum, and it has been held in London ever since, with a significant loan to Iran in 2010 that caused considerable diplomatic tension. It is not a large object. You could hold it in two hands. But what it says, and what it has meant across the centuries of its interpretation, gives it a weight far beyond its physical size. The cylinder records Cyrus's conquest of Babylon and his policy toward the peoples and gods of the lands he conquered. He presents himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror, as a king chosen by the Babylonian god Marduk to restore order and piety to a city that had been badly governed. He announces that he will allow the peoples who had been displaced by Babylonian policy to return to their homelands and take their gods with them. He describes restoring temples and sanctuaries that had been neglected or destroyed. The policy it describes, of returning displaced peoples to their homelands, of allowing conquered peoples to worship their own gods, of presenting conquest as liberation rather than domination, is consistent with what the biblical books of Ezra and Isaiah describe Cyrus as having done for the Jewish people specifically. The book of Ezra opens with a proclamation attributed to Cyrus. "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel." The Cyrus cylinder does not mention the Jewish people specifically. It is a general statement of policy rather than a specific decree, but it confirms that the kind of policy attributed to Cyrus in the biblical text is historically consistent with what we know of the real Cyrus and his actual governing style. A king who ruled an empire by allowing conquered peoples to return home and worship freely, and who left a clay cylinder in the foundations of a Babylonian wall to say so, is the same king who appears in the pages of Ezra and Isaiah, releasing the Jewish exiles from Babylon and sending them home to rebuild their temple. Isaiah, writing or being written in the context of the Babylonian exile, calls Cyrus by name, an extraordinary thing if the text was written before Cyrus's birth, and a remarkable coincidence at the very least, and refers to him as God's anointed, the Hebrew word Mashiach, the same word translated as Messiah. A Persian king, worshipping Persian gods, conducting Persian politics, is called by a Hebrew prophet the anointed of the God of Israel. The cylinder that Cyrus left in the ground of Babylon is the physical expression of the worldview behind that title, the worldview of a king who understood that power, exercised with a degree of tolerance and generosity, could outlast power exercised with pure force. The cylinder has outlasted the empire it came from, the city it was buried in, and most of the civilizations that have risen and fallen in the ground above it. It sits in its glass case in the British Museum, patient as only clay can be patient, waiting for each new visitor to come and read what Cyrus left to say. The Ugaritic Tablets. In the spring of 1929, a French archaeologist named Claude Schaeffer began excavating a large mound on the Syrian coast near the modern town of Latakia. The site was called Ras Shamra, Cape Fennel, and it turned out to be the ruins of the ancient city of Ugarit, a cosmopolitan Bronze Age port that had been a center of trade, diplomacy, and culture in the 14th and 13th centuries BC, before its sudden and still not fully explained destruction around 1185 BC. What Schaeffer and his team found there, over decades of excavation, transformed our understanding of the ancient Canaanite world in which the religion of ancient Israel was born and against which it defined itself. The Ugaritic tablets are a collection of clay documents written in a previously unknown alphabetic cuneiform script, a script that, once deciphered, turned out to represent a Semitic language closely related to ancient Hebrew. They were deciphered with remarkable speed after their discovery. Within a year, several scholars working independently had cracked the script, and what they revealed was a rich literary and religious tradition that illuminated the biblical texts in ways that scholars had not anticipated. The tablets contain myths, legends, ritual texts, administrative records, and correspondence, and among the most significant are the mythological texts describing the Canaanite pantheon, the divine world against which the biblical prophets railed for centuries. In the Ugaritic myths, the chief god is El, whose name also appears in the Hebrew Bible as a name for the God of Israel, and who is described in Ugaritic texts in terms a father figure, ancient and serene, seated among his divine council, that resonate with certain descriptions of God in the Psalms and the Book of Job. The storm god Baal, the deity whose worship appears repeatedly in the biblical narrative as the great temptation of ancient Israel, the god of the Canaanites whom Elijah confronts on Mount Carmel, is the hero of a great mythological cycle in the Ugaritic texts, a cycle describing his battles with the sea and with death, his death and resurrection, his enthronement as king of the gods. Reading the Ball cycle alongside the Psalms, scholars notice striking parallels in imagery and language, in the themes of divine kingship and cosmic battle. The biblical poets who described God riding on the clouds, who praised God as the one who defeated the sea and the waters of chaos, were drawing on a mythological vocabulary they shared with their Canaanite neighbors. They were not simply rejecting that vocabulary. They were transforming it, taking the images and the language of the world around them and reshaping them in the service of a different theological vision. The city of Ugarit itself was destroyed so suddenly. The tablets found in one house include a letter warning of enemy ships seen at sea, never sent, still in the oven where it was being fired when the city fell, that its destruction has the quality of a freeze frame, a moment caught in time. The scribes were at their tables. The baker had bread in his oven. The merchants had goods in their storehouses. And then it was over. The sea peoples, mysterious and still not fully identified raiders who appear to have contributed to the collapse of Bronze Age civilization across the eastern Mediterranean, came, and Ugarit never recovered. Its ruins lay under the mound of Ras Shamra for 3,000 years, and its tablets lay with them, preserving the voices of a world that had otherwise been almost entirely lost. The Apure Papyrus. In the Egyptian Museum in Leiden, Netherlands, there is an ancient papyrus that has generated more controversy, more speculation, and more impassioned debate than almost any other artifact in the collection. It is called the Admonitions of Apure, or simply the Apure Papyrus, and it is a literary text written in the late Middle Egyptian language. Preserved on a papyrus that dates to approximately the 13th century BCE, though the text itself may be considerably older, perhaps composed as early as the late 3rd millennium BC. The text is a lament. It describes Egypt in a state of catastrophic disorder. The Nile turned to blood so that no one can drink from it, livestock dying, darkness covering the land, fire consuming what remains, foreigners everywhere, the social order inverted so that the poor are rich and the rich are poor, the dead unburied, children abandoned. Reading it alongside the account of the 10 plagues in the book of Exodus is an experience that has led some readers to conclude that the two texts are describing the same events, that the Apure Papyrus is an Egyptian account of the plagues that the Bible records as the context of the Israelite exodus from Egypt. Scholars are cautious about this connection, and for good reason. The Apure text belongs to a well-established Egyptian literary genre, the lament over social disorder, of which several other examples exist, and its descriptions may be literary and rhetorical rather than historical. The parallels with the Exodus plagues are striking in some places and absent in others. The dating is uncertain, and the Egyptian text contains no mention of Israelites, of Moses, or of any of the specific figures or events that the biblical account describes. And yet the papyrus sits in its case in Leiden and refuses to be entirely dismissed. The image of the Nile running red, of darkness over Egypt, of a land turned upside down, these images appear in both texts, separated by whatever distance lies between them, speaking across that distance in a language of catastrophe that sounds, in both cases, like the memory of something real. Whether they describe the same events, parallel events, or simply the same literary tradition of lamentation, the Apure Papyrus is a reminder that Egypt and Israel, for all that the biblical narrative presents them as opposites, as oppressor and oppressed, as the house of slavery and the house of freedom shared a world, a climate, a river, and a vocabulary of suffering that no border between them could entirely separate. The Tel Arad Ostraka. In the Negev desert of southern Israel, at a site called Tel Arad, the remains of an ancient Israelite fortress have been excavated over many decades of painstaking work. Arad was a military outpost guarding the southern approaches to the Kingdom of Judah, and it was occupied and reoccupied across several centuries of the Iron Age. From its ruins came one of the largest collections of Hebrew ostraca, inscribed pottery sherds, ever discovered in Israel. More than 100 inscribed pieces, many of them administrative records and military correspondence from the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, the final decades of the Kingdom of Judah before the Babylonian destruction. The Arad ostraca include letters from a commander named Eliashib, who administered the fortress's storerooms and received written orders regarding the distribution of food supplies, specifically wine, oil, and flour, to various groups, including a group referred to as the Kidium, a term used in the biblical texts for people from the Aegean world, possibly Greek mercenaries serving in the Judean army. These administrative letters are mundane in the way that all bureaucratic records are mundane. They are about rations and logistics and the movement of supplies, and that mundanity is precisely what makes them valuable. They reveal an administrative system of considerable sophistication operating at the level of a desert garrison in the final years of the kingdom, literate officers, standardized record-keeping, a supply chain that connected the fortress to the broader economic infrastructure of Judah. One of the most significant of the Arad letters, Letter 18, appears to give orders for the withdrawal of troops to Jerusalem in response to a military threat from Edom to the south and east. If the dating is correct, this letter may have been written in the very years leading up to the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, and the threat from Edom it describes may be connected to the bitter denunciations of Edom that appear in the prophets of that period, Obadiah, Ezekiel, and the Psalms, where Edom is accused of treachery against Judah in its hour of greatest need. A military dispatch from a desert fortress, ordering troops to the capital, and the anguished poetry of prophets crying out against a neighboring nation's betrayal, may be documents from the same crisis, written in the same desperate season. The stepped stone structure of Jerusalem. Beneath the houses and streets of the modern city of David, the oldest part of Jerusalem, the narrow ridge south of the old city walls where the earliest settlement of the city was established, there is a structure of ancient stones that has been known to archaeologists for more than a century, but whose full significance is still being debated. It is called the stepped stone structure, a massive retaining wall of field stones built in stepped courses up the eastern slope of the city of David Ridge, rising more than 18 meters in height, covering an area of some 250 square meters and dating, in its earliest phases, to the Late Bronze Age or the beginning of the Iron Age, with significant additions and modifications in the Iron Age IA period that most chronologies associate with the early Israelite monarchy, the time of David and Solomon. The stepped stone structure is the largest Iron Age architectural feature ever discovered in Jerusalem. It was clearly built to support something, a significant structure on the top of the ridge, a building of considerable size and importance, whose foundations it was designed to stabilize against the slope. Some archaeologists have proposed that it supported the millo, a Hebrew word meaning filling or terrace, mentioned several times in the biblical texts in connection with David's building activities in Jerusalem and Solomon's subsequent construction projects. Others have suggested it may be the foundation of a significant public building, perhaps a palace or administrative center of the early Israelite monarchy. Adjacent to the upper portion of the step stone structure, a large building known as the Large Stone Structure has been excavated by the Israeli archaeologist Eilat Mazar, who proposed, in a hypothesis that generated considerable controversy, that it might be the remains of David's palace, described in the second book of Samuel as the house of cedar that Hiram of Tyre built for the king. The dating of the large stone structure and its identification remain debated. But the combination of the massive stepped retaining wall and the large building it supported, located precisely where the biblical texts place the royal quarter of early Jerusalem, speaks of a center of power and administration in the right place at roughly the right time, not proof of any specific biblical narrative, but a physical reality of considerable scale that demands to be accounted for in any serious reconstruction of early Jerusalem's history. The hieroglyphic stairway of Copan. Our journey carries us now beyond the lands of the Bible's immediate geography, not in search of a biblical artifact specifically, but in search of something that illuminates, by the wideness of its contrast, the extraordinary nature of the ancient world's relationship to writing and memory. At the Maya site of Copan in western Honduras, there is a stairway of 63 steps rising to a temple platform, and carved into each of those steps, in the Mayan hieroglyphic script, is text, 2,200 individual hieroglyphs in total, making it the longest known pre-Columbian inscription in the Americas. The hieroglyphic stairway records the dynastic history of the Copan kings across nearly 2 centuries, and it was commissioned by a ruler named Waxaclajuan Abba Kawil in the early 8th century CE. The reason for including the hieroglyphic stairway in a journey through biblical artifacts is not because it has any connection to the biblical world. It does not. It is because it illustrates something universal and profoundly human, the impulse to carve words into stone, to make memory permanent, to declare that what happened here mattered and should be remembered. The same impulse that drove the Moabite king Mesha to commission a black basalt stele, that drove Hezekiah's workers to inscribe the story of their tunnel breakthrough in the limestone wall of their achievement, that drove the community at Qumran to copy and preserve their sacred texts in clay jars in desert caves. That same impulse drove a Maya king to cover an entire ceremonial stairway with the story of his dynasty, step by carved step. Across every culture, across every language, across every geography, human beings have always wanted to say, "We were here, and this is what we did, and we want you to know it." The stairway at Copan and the stele at Dibon and the ostraca at Arad are all expressions of the same deep human need, the need to speak across time, to reach forward through the dark toward a future that cannot yet be seen, and leave something there for it to find. The Aramaic inscription of Zachar. In 1903, a French archaeologist named Henri Pognon discovered, at a site in northern Syria, a basalt stele bearing an Aramaic inscription commissioned by a king named Zachar, who ruled the small Syrian kingdom of Hamath and Lush in the early 8th century BC. The inscription describes a military crisis. A coalition of Aramean kings, led by Barhadad son of Hazael of Damascus, besieged Zachar in his city of Hazrak. Surrounded and threatened, Zachar prayed to his god Balshaman. the Lord of Heaven, and received a prophetic response delivered through seers and diviners, assuring him that the god would save him. The siege was lifted, and Zacher erected his stele to commemorate both his deliverance and his gratitude. The inscription is significant for several reasons. Bar-Hadad, son of Hazael, is mentioned in the biblical text. The second book of Kings describes the Aramean king Hazael and his son Ben-Hadad, and the political struggles between Aram and Israel during this period are a recurring theme in the biblical narrative of the 9th and 8th centuries BC. The Zacher stele places these figures in a broader regional context. A world of competing small kingdoms, shifting coalitions, and constant diplomatic and military maneuvering that is entirely consistent with the picture the biblical text presents. But what is perhaps most striking about the Zacher inscription is its account of prophetic communication. Zacher describes receiving divine assurance through seers and diviners in language that is structurally very similar to the prophetic oracle form found throughout the biblical prophetic books, the divine speech introduced by a formula, the specific assurance of deliverance, the direct address to the king. Prophecy, the phenomenon of human beings claiming to receive and transmit divine messages, particularly in times of crisis, was not unique to ancient Israel. It was a widespread feature of the ancient Near Eastern world. The Zacher stele is one of the clearest non-biblical examples of this phenomenon, and it places the biblical prophets, Amos and Hosea and Isaiah and the rest, in a world where their activity, however distinctive its content and its theology, was a recognizable form of religious and political communication. They were not isolated voices crying in a vacuum. They were participants in a conversation that the whole ancient world was having, in its own various ways, about the relationship between human crisis and divine response. The Byzantine Madaba map. On the floor of the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George in the Jordanian town of Madaba, beneath the feet of worshippers who have walked across it for more than 14 centuries, there lies a mosaic map. It was created in the 6th century CE, during the Byzantine period, and it originally measured approximately 21 meters by 7 meters, large enough to cover the floor of an entire room. Most of it has been lost to the damage of centuries and the construction of later buildings over it. But what survives, a section approximately 10 meters by 5 meters, discovered in 1884 when the church was being rebuilt, is one of the most extraordinary cartographic documents from the ancient world. The Madaba map depicts the geography of the Holy Land and surrounding regions as they were understood in the 6th century CE: the eastern Mediterranean coast, the Nile Delta, the Sinai Peninsula, the Jordan Valley, and the cities, towns, rivers, and geographical features of the biblical world, all rendered in colored stone tesserae with remarkable detail and considerable accuracy. Jerusalem occupies the center of the surviving portion of the map, the holy city at the center of the world, as Byzantine theology understood it, and it is depicted in such detail that individual streets and buildings can be identified. The Cardo Maximus, the great colonnaded street that ran through Byzantine Jerusalem, is clearly visible. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site traditionally identified as the tomb of Jesus, is prominently marked. The Damascus Gate and the Lion's Gate and the general layout of the city are recognizable when compared with what archaeology has revealed of Byzantine Jerusalem's actual plan. For archaeologists and biblical geographers, the Madaba map is an invaluable resource, a document that preserves the names and locations of dozens of ancient sites, some of which might otherwise have been lost or difficult to identify. It is also a document of the Byzantine world's deep and lived relationship with the geography of the Bible, a world in which the landscape of Scripture was also the landscape of daily life, in which you could walk from your house to a mosaic map on a church floor and find your village marked there, embedded in the same geography as the stories you had heard since childhood. The tesserae that make up the map were laid by hand, one, by craftsmen whose names are unknown, working in a building that would stand for 15 centuries. They could not have imagined that the floor they were laying would still be there, still being looked at, still being studied, more than 1,400 years after they set the last stone in place. The Arch of Titus. At the top of the Sacred Way in Rome, at the eastern entrance to the Roman Forum, there stands a triumphal arch erected by the Roman Senate and people to commemorate the victories of the Emperor Titus. It was completed around 82 CE, shortly after Titus's death, and it has stood in that spot for nearly 2,000 years, through the fall of the Western Roman Empire, through the medieval period when it was incorporated into a fortified tower by the Frangipani family, through the Renaissance, through the rise and fall of modern states, through everything the city of Rome has been and become since the 1st century CE. The Arch of Titus commemorates two things specifically: Titus's victory in the Jewish war that ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and his triumphal procession through Rome carrying the spoils of the temple. And it is the interior reliefs of the arch that have given it a particular and painful significance in Jewish history for nearly 2,000 years. On one side of the archway, a relief panel depicts the triumphal procession carrying the sacred objects of the Jerusalem temple through the streets of Rome: the golden menorah, the 7-branch lampstand, carried on the shoulders of Roman soldiers, the silver trumpets, the table of the showbread. On the other side, Titus rides in his triumphal chariot, crowned with a laurel wreath by the goddess Victory. For Jewish communities in Rome and across the diaspora, the Arch of Titus became a symbol of national catastrophe, of the destruction of the temple and the beginning of the long exile. There was a tradition among Roman Jews of never walking through the arch, of going around it rather than passing beneath the image of the menorah being carried away in Roman hands. When the modern state of Israel was established in 1948, there were celebrations in Rome in which Jewish communities walked through the arch in the other direction, from west to east, symbolically reversing the direction of the triumphal procession, reclaiming what had been taken. The arch stood there through all of it, as arches do, holding its carved images of a procession that took place 19 centuries ago, a permanent record in stone of one of the most consequential events in Jewish history, the moment when the temple was lost, and the world the temple had organized was lost with it, and the long work of building a new world from the ruins had to begin. The menorah depicted on the Arch of Titus, its specific shape, the form of its base, the details of its decoration, is one of the most important pieces of evidence we have for what the temple menorah actually looked like. It has influenced the design of the menorah on the official emblem of the modern state of Israel. The image carved by Roman craftsmen into a Roman triumphal arch commemorating a Roman military victory has become the most authoritative visual source for a sacred object of the Jewish people. History, again, arranges its ironies with a quiet and unsettling precision. The Sumerian King List. There is a small clay prism, about 20 centimeters tall, sitting in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. It is inscribed on all four of its sides with cuneiform text, and it was written sometime around 2100 BCE in the ancient Sumerian city of Isen. It is called the Sumerian King List, and it is one of the most extraordinary and puzzling documents to survive from the ancient world, a document that begins in the realm of myth and ends in the realm of history, and whose transition between the two is so gradual and so seamlessly managed that it raises profound questions about where, in the ancient mind, one ended and the other began. The King List opens before the Great Flood. It lists the kings who ruled in the cities of ancient Sumer before the waters came, and it gives their reigns in numbers that strain the imagination. One king ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000, another for 43,200. 8 kings in total, ruling across 5 cities, their combined reigns stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. And then the flood sweeps over the earth, and kingship descends from heaven again, and the reigns begin to shorten, still impossibly long by any historical standard, but shortening, gradually, across the dynasties that follow, until we arrive in periods that can be cross-referenced with other ancient sources, and the reigns become recognizable, human, historical. The parallel with the Book of Genesis is one of the most discussed topics in the comparative study of ancient Near Eastern literature. Genesis also contains a list of figures who lived before the flood: Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, and the rest, with lifespans that, while not as extreme as the Sumerian kings, are far beyond anything in ordinary human experience. Methuselah's 969 years, Noah's 950, Adam's 930. Both traditions, the Sumerian and the biblical, use extreme longevity to mark the antediluvian world as different in kind from the world that follows the flood. Both understand the flood as a dividing line in human history, a moment after which something fundamental changed. Both preserve the memory of a time before the waters as a time of a different order of existence, longer, perhaps larger, certainly stranger than the world we inhabit now. The Sumerian King List is not evidence that the biblical flood account is historically accurate, any more than the biblical account is evidence for the Sumerian one. What both documents together suggest is something more interesting, that across the ancient Near Eastern world, from the earliest periods of written culture, there circulated a shared set of narrative traditions about the deep past, about the world before the flood, about the flood itself, about the long descent from mythological antiquity toward the historical present. The biblical writers were not working in isolation. They were participants in a broad cultural conversation about origins and memory and the nature of time that the whole ancient world was having, and the Sumerian King List is one of the oldest and most remarkable documents in that conversation. The prism itself, four-sided, inscribed on every surface, baked hard and preserved in the dry soil of ancient Iraq for 4,000 years, has a quiet beauty to it. Someone held it in their hands when the ink was still wet on the clay. Someone read it aloud in a scribal school, learning the names of the ancient kings the way students learn the names of dynasties today, as an exercise in memory and history in the particular way that a civilization chooses to understand its own past. The names of those kings and their impossible reigns are still there, pressed into the clay by a stylus held in a hand that has been dust for 40 centuries, waiting for the next reader to come and take them in. The Temple Scroll. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Temple Scroll holds a particular distinction. It is the longest of all the scrolls, stretching to approximately 8.75 meters when fully unrolled, and it is one of the most ambitious in its scope and its vision. It was acquired by the Israeli archaeologist and military officer Yigal Yadin in 1967 through circumstances that involved the Six-Day War, a Bethlehem antiquities dealer, and a negotiation conducted under considerable pressure and urgency, and it is now held at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, in the same remarkable museum that houses the great Isaiah scroll. The Temple Scroll presents itself as a direct divine speech, as God speaking in the first person to Moses, giving detailed instructions for the construction and operation of an ideal temple, a temple far grander and more elaborately specified than the one Solomon built or the one that stood in Jerusalem in the Second Temple period. The scroll describes the temple's dimensions and layout in extraordinary detail, its courts and gates and chambers, the rituals to be performed within it, the rules governing purity and impurity, the calendar of festivals, and the sacrifices appropriate to each. It is, in a sense, a vision of the temple as it should be, a blueprint for a sacred space that was never built but was imagined with the precision and the longing of people for whom the temple was the center of the world. Reading the Temple Scroll, or reading about it, in the translations and commentaries that scholars have produced, is an experience that illuminates the intensity of the ancient Jewish relationship with the temple as an institution. The temple was not merely a building where sacrifices were performed. It was the point of contact between heaven and earth, the place where the divine presence dwelt among the human community, the organizing center of time and space and communal life. The community at Qumran, who may have produced or preserved the Temple Scroll, had withdrawn from Jerusalem and from the actual temple, which they considered corrupted and improperly administered. But they had not withdrawn from the idea of the temple. They had internalized it, elaborated it, dreamed it into an ideal form that the actual temple had never achieved and perhaps never could. The scroll is an act of imagination as much as an act of legislation, the vision of a community that had lost the thing it loved most and was keeping it alive in words. The physical scroll itself is remarkable in its preservation. Its surface is prepared with extraordinary care, thinner and finer than most other parchment scrolls from the period, and its script is elegant and regular. Someone spent enormous effort making this object as beautiful as the vision it contained. The length of it, unrolled, is the length of a room, 8.5 meters of careful writing, preserved in a cave above the Dead Sea for 2,000 years, folded in on itself like a secret, waiting for a war and an archaeologist and a negotiation in a Bethlehem hotel room to bring it back into the light. The Gezer High Place. At the ancient Canaanite and Israelite city of Gezer, the same site where the agricultural calendar was found, there stands in the open air a row of 10 large standing stones, or masboth, arranged in a rough north-south line. They are made of local limestone. They range in height from 1 to 3 meters, and they have been standing in that spot, in various states of preservation, since sometime in the Middle Bronze Age, approximately 1600 BCE. They are one of the best preserved examples of a Canaanite high place ever discovered in the ancient Levant. The masbah, the standing stone, is one of the most ubiquitous religious objects of the ancient Near Eastern world. Stones were set upright at sacred sites, at burial places, at the locations of significant events, as markers of divine presence or divine encounter. Jacob, in the book of Genesis, takes a stone he has used as a pillow after his dream of the ladder reaching to heaven, sets it upright, pours oil over it, and declares it to be the house of God, Bethel. Moses, in the book of Exodus, erects 12 standing stones at the foot of Sinai to mark the covenant between God and the 12 tribes of Israel. The prophets and the Deuteronomic historians repeatedly condemn the Masboth found at the high places of Canaan as sites of illegitimate worship, and their very condemnation is evidence of how widespread and persistent the practice of erecting standing stones was in the ancient Israelite world. The Gezer standing stones have been associated, by some archaeologists, with a sanctuary or treaty site, a place where covenant oaths were sworn between groups, the stones serving as witnesses to the agreements made in their presence. Others have interpreted them as funerary monuments or as markers of a sacred precinct dedicated to Canaanite deities. The truth is that we do not know with certainty what ritual purpose they served, and that uncertainty is itself informative. It reminds us that the religious life of the ancient world was more complex, more varied, and more locally specific than any single interpretive framework can fully capture. What is certain is that those 10 stones have been standing in the soil of Gezer for more than 3,000 years. They have been there through the Canaanite period, through the period of Israelite occupation described in the biblical texts, through the Hellenistic and Roman periods, through the Byzantine and Islamic periods, through the Crusades, through the Ottoman Empire, through the modern states that have succeeded it. Empires have risen and fallen around them. Languages have come and gone. And the stones stand, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the passage of time, in the dry air of the Shephelah, as they have always stood. The Elephantine Jewish Temple. We have visited the Elephantine Jewish community before, in the context of the papyri they left behind. But the physical remains of the temple they built on that small Nile island deserve a moment of their own, because the existence of that temple raises questions that go to the heart of biblical history and the development of Jewish religious practice. The Jewish military colony at Elephantine built a temple to their god, whom they called YHW, a form of the divine name, on the island of Yeb sometime before the Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BC. This temple, where they offered sacrifices and conducted religious rituals, existed simultaneously with the temple in Jerusalem, the temple that the book of Deuteronomy declares to be the one and only legitimate place of sacrifice, the single sanctuary where God has chosen to place his name. The Elephantine Jews appear to have been unaware of or unconcerned by this theological principle. They simply built a temple where they were and worshipped in it. The existence of the Elephantine Temple suggests that the principle of centralized worship at a single sanctuary, a principle that the book of Deuteronomy presents as foundational to Israelite religion, was either unknown to the Elephantine community, or known and disregarded, or represents a theological development that had not yet been universally accepted in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE when the community was established. This is a window into the diversity of ancient Israelite religious practice, a reminder that the unified, centralized religion described in the later biblical texts was the product of a long historical process of consolidation and standardization, and that for much of the biblical period, The religious landscape of Israel and Judah was considerably more varied than the canonical texts suggest. The temple at Elephantine was destroyed around 410 BCE by Egyptian priests who resented its presence and took advantage of the temporary absence of the Persian governor who had protected it. The Elephantine papyri contain the community's desperate letters seeking permission to rebuild it, their promises to restrict the sacrifices they would offer, their appeals to the authorities in Jerusalem and Samaria for support. The temple was eventually rebuilt, though on a reduced scale. It disappears from the record sometime in the early 4th century BCE, along with the community that built it. What remains is the correspondence, the letters written on papyrus in Aramaic, the record of a community's fight to maintain its sacred space, its urgent and entirely human insistence that this place mattered, that the loss of it was not something that could simply be absorbed and moved past. The stones of the temple are gone. The words that fought for it survive. The Nineveh Library of Ashurbanipal. In the ruins of the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh, the great city that the prophet Jonah was commanded to warn, the city that the prophet Nahum celebrated the destruction of, the city that was for centuries the capital of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. British archaeologists working in the 1840s and 1850s discovered something that would transform the study of the ancient Near East more completely than almost any other find of the 19th century. In the ruins of the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who reigned from approximately 668 to 627 BCE, they found the remains of a great royal library, more than 30,000 clay tablets and fragments, inscribed in cuneiform with texts of every kind, omen series, ritual texts, medical texts, astronomical observations, royal annals, and literary works of breathtaking ambition and scope. Ashurbanipal was, by the standards of ancient Near Eastern rulers, an unusual figure, a king who was also a scholar, who boasted in his royal inscriptions of his ability to read the cuneiform script and to understand the difficult texts of the scribal tradition, who sent agents across his empire to collect and copy texts for his library in Nineveh. He was building, deliberately and systematically, a repository of the accumulated knowledge and literature of Mesopotamian civilization, a project of cultural conservation on a scale that had not been attempted before and would not be attempted again for centuries. Among the texts preserved in Ashurbanipal's library was a series of 12 tablets containing the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great Babylonian literary masterpiece that tells the story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, his friendship with the wild man Enkidu, his search for immortality after Enkidu's death, and his encounter with Utnapishtim, the sole human survivor of a great flood sent by the gods. The flood story in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which Utnapishtim is warned by a god to build a great boat, take aboard the seed of all living things, ride out a storm of catastrophic violence, and come to rest on a mountain when the waters recede, sending out birds to test whether the land has appeared, is so similar in its narrative structure to the flood story in Genesis that when the Assyriologist George Smith first translated it in 1872 and announced his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, a member of the audience fainted from shock. The audience had just heard that the flood story they had always understood as unique to the biblical tradition had a Babylonian predecessor, written on clay tablets in a library in Nineveh, that predated the biblical text by centuries. The Library of Ashurbanipal and its tablets now reside in the British Museum, where they have been studied by generations of scholars. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest great work of literature in the world, the first story ever written down about a human being's confrontation with mortality and the desire to transcend it, is there in its clay tablets, pressed by hands that held the stylus 4,000 years ago, waiting in its glass case for the next reader to stand before it and feel, across the millennia, the weight of everything it carries. The Siloam inscription's lost twin. We have visited the Siloam tunnel and its inscription before, the account of the workers breaking through to meet each other in the dark, carved into the tunnel wall in the late 8th century BC. But there is a companion to that story that is less well known, and that carries its own quiet weight. When archaeologists and explorers began serious investigation of the ancient water systems of Jerusalem in the 19th century, they found not just the Siloam tunnel but traces of an earlier water system, an older tunnel, sometimes called Warren's Shaft after the British engineer Charles Warren, who explored it in 1867, that had served Jerusalem's water needs before Hezekiah's tunnel was cut. Warren's Shaft is a complex system of tunnels and shafts that connected the Gin Spring to the interior of the city, allowing Jerusalemites to lower vessels on ropes to reach the water from inside the city walls without exposing themselves to attack. It was a remarkable piece of ancient engineering, older than Hezekiah's tunnel by perhaps several centuries, its origins reaching back into the period of the early Israelite monarchy, or even earlier. The significance of Warren's Shaft in the biblical context lies in a single verse in the second book of Samuel, in the account of David's capture of Jerusalem from the Jebusites. The verse contains a difficult Hebrew word, sinner, that has been translated variously as water shaft, grappling hook, and windpipe, and that has generated centuries of debate about how exactly David and his men entered and captured the Jebusite city. One prominent interpretation, that Joab, David's commander, led a force up through the water shaft into the heart of the city, taking its defenders by surprise, would make Warren's Shaft the very passage through which Jerusalem first became a Davidic city. The shaft may have been the back door through which a dynasty entered, the hidden passage that changed the course of Israelite history. We cannot know for certain. The text is ambiguous, the archaeology is complex, and the specific moment of David's capture of Jerusalem is not the kind of event that leaves the kind of physical evidence that could confirm or deny any particular interpretation. But standing at the entrance to Warren's Shaft, in the darkness of the ancient tunnel system, with the sound of water below, it is possible to feel the proximity of that old story in a way that no amount of reading quite achieves. The rock is the same rock. The dark is the same dark. The water is still there, still moving through the channels that ancient hands cut for it, still finding its way through the limestone of Jerusalem as it has always found its way, patient and quiet and indifferent to the arguments of scholars and kings alike. The Bubastite Portal. At the great temple complex of Karnak in Luxor, Egypt, a place of such overwhelming scale and antiquity that visitors often describe a feeling of quiet vertigo in its presence, a sense of the human being reduced to something very small by the accumulated weight of so many centuries of sacred architecture. There is a gateway known as the Bubastite Portal. It was built by the pharaoh Sheshankai, founder of the 22nd dynasty, who ruled Egypt in the 10th century BC. And carved into its walls, in the hieroglyphic tradition of Egyptian royal victory inscriptions, is a list of the cities and territories that Sheshonq conquered during a military campaign into the Levant, into the land of Canaan, into the kingdoms that the biblical texts identify as Israel and Judah. Sheshonq I is identified by most scholars with the biblical figure of Shishak, the Egyptian pharaoh who, in the 5th year of the reign of Rehoboam, son of Solomon, invaded Judah and plundered the temple in Jerusalem. The account in the first book of Kings is brief. Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem and carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including all the gold shields Solomon had made. The account in the second book of Chronicles is slightly more expansive, noting that Shishak came with 1,200 chariots, 60,000 horsemen, and a vast army, and that Rehoboam submitted to him and gave him everything in order to avoid the destruction of the city. The Bubastite portal at Karnak does not mention Rehoboam by name, and it does not describe the plundering of the temple in Jerusalem specifically. But it does list, among the cities conquered during Sheshonq's campaign, names that can be identified with sites in ancient Israel and Judah, sites in the Negev, in the Shephelah, in the northern kingdom. The inscription is damaged and its reading is disputed in some places, and the question of whether Jerusalem itself appears in the list is one of those points of scholarly debate that has not been fully resolved. But the existence of the inscription confirms that a major Egyptian military campaign into the Levant occurred during the 10th century BC, precisely when the biblical text says it did, and that its commander was a pharaoh whose name corresponds, in the transliteration between Egyptian and Hebrew, to the Shishak of the biblical account. The walls of Karnak and the pages of the Bible are describing the same event, from opposite sides of the same campaign. The Horvat Kor Synagogue Mosaic. On the shores of the Sea of Galilee, at a site called Horvat Kor in northern Israel, archaeologists have been excavating since 2010 a Byzantine-period synagogue that has yielded a remarkable mosaic floor. One that sheds unexpected light on the Jewish communities of the Galilee region in the 4th and 5th centuries CE and on the artistic traditions through which those communities express their identity and their faith. The Horvat Kor mosaic is notable for several reasons. It depicts a Torah ark, the cabinet in which the Torah scrolls are housed in a synagogue, flanked by menorahs and other Jewish symbols, in a style consistent with other mosaic floors from ancient synagogues in the region. But it also contains an inscription in Greek, the everyday language of much of the Roman and Byzantine Levant, even in Jewish communities, that identifies the donors who funded the mosaic, naming individuals and families who contributed to its creation. The names are a mixture of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek names, reflecting the multilingual and multicultural reality of Jewish life in the Roman period. These are real people, named in stone, who paid for a floor in their community synagogue and wanted to be remembered for it. The ancient synagogue mosaic floors of the Galilee region, at Beit Alpha, at Sepphoris, at Hamath Tiberias, at Horvat Kor, and a dozen other sites, collectively form one of the most remarkable bodies of Jewish art to survive from antiquity. They depict not only Jewish religious symbols but also, at some sites, the signs of the zodiac arranged around the figure of the sun god Helios, a borrowing from the visual vocabulary of the surrounding Greco-Roman world that speaks of a Judaism far more comfortable with its cultural environment and far more creative in its self-expression than the stereotype of strict iconoclasm would suggest. These mosaics were laid by Jewish craftsmen, commissioned by Jewish communities, installed in Jewish houses of prayer, and they depict, without apparent discomfort, images drawn from the broader artistic world of late antiquity, integrated into a Jewish symbolic program that transformed them into something distinctly and confidently Jewish. The Sea of Galilee, on whose shores the Horvat Core Synagogue stood, is one of the most evocative geographical settings in the New Testament. The body of water on whose shores Jesus is described as calling his first disciples, walking on the water, stilling the storm. The Jewish communities that built and worshipped in the Horvat Core Synagogue in the 4th and 5th centuries CE were the inheritors of the same Galilean world that the Gospel narratives describe, living in the same landscape, fishing the same waters, speaking variants of the same languages. Their mosaic floor, with its named donors and its Torah ark and its menorahs, is a window into the living continuity of Jewish life in the land that both testaments call home. The Pontius Pilate Ring. In 1968 and 1969, archaeologists excavating the Herodian palace fortress of Herodium, the artificial mountain that Herod the Great built as his intended burial place, southeast of Bethlehem, found among the artifacts of the site a plain copper alloy ring bearing a seal impression. The ring was not remarkable by the standards of ancient jewelry. It was simple, functional, the kind of ring a minor official or a soldier might wear rather than a great king or a wealthy aristocrat. It sat in storage at the Israel Antiquities Authority for decades, cleaned and catalogued but not intensively studied. Then in 2018, new photographic analysis of the ring's seal impression revealed something that had not been noticed before. The image on the seal appeared to be an amphora, a storage vessel, surrounded by a Greek inscription that read, when deciphered, Pilatos, Pilate. The ring, dating to the 1st century CE and found at a site associated with the Herodian administrative apparatus, bore the name of the Roman prefect who appears in all 4 Gospels as the official who condemned Jesus to crucifixion. The identification is not universally accepted. Pilatos was not an uncommon name in the Roman world, and the attribution of the ring specifically to Pontius Pilate himself, rather than to a member of his household, a freedman, or a local official who happened to share the name, cannot be made with certainty. But the ring comes from the right place, the right time, and the right administrative context. Herodium was a site of Herodian and Roman administrative activity. A ring bearing the name Pilate, found in that context, dating to the 1st century CE, is at minimum consistent with the presence of the Roman prefect's administrative apparatus at the site, and at maximum, it is the personal seal ring of the man who signed the death warrant that appears on the placard above the cross in every gospel account. The ring is small and plain and unassuming, the kind of object that gets overlooked, that sits in storage for decades without attracting attention. That it waited 50 years in a drawer before being properly studied is a reminder of how much remains to be discovered not only in the ground of the ancient world, but in the storage rooms and archives of the institutions that have been excavating that ground for a century and a half. The ancient world's secrets are not all buried. Some of them are sitting in boxes, waiting for a better photograph, a sharper eye, a new question that reframes what has always been there to be seen. The Copper Scroll's promised treasure. We have visited the Copper Scroll before, that unique and haunting document from the Dead Sea Scrolls corpus, inscribed not on parchment but on thin sheets of copper, listing 64 locations where vast quantities of gold, silver, and sacred objects are said to be hidden. But the Copper Scroll deserves a final, fuller meditation, because it is in some ways the most mysterious and the most human of all the artifacts we have visited on this long journey. The scroll was found in Cave 3 at Qumran in 1952, rolled into a cylinder and too brittle to be unrolled without destroying it. It was taken to Manchester, England, where it was carefully cut into strips at the Manchester College of Technology in 1955 and 1956, and its text was read for the first time in the modern era. What the text contained sent a ripple of excitement through the scholarly world and has never quite stopped generating debate. The treasure it describes is staggering in its scale. The scroll lists, location by location, quantities of gold and silver bullion, sacred vessels, tithes, and priestly garments that together, if taken literally, would represent a quantity of precious metal far exceeding anything that the Second Temple is known to have possessed. The locations are described with a specificity that reads like a real inventory. Under the stairs of the Eastern Passage, in the water conduit of the Northern Chamber, in the tomb of the common people, 18 cubits from the white stone. The directions are precise but frustratingly obscure. The landmarks they reference are unknown. The geography they describe has been interpreted in multiple ways. The units of measurement are uncertain. Treasure hunters have followed the Copper Scroll's directions into the hills around Qumran and into the tunnels and cisterns beneath Jerusalem for more than 70 years. Nothing has been found. This absence has led some scholars to conclude that the scroll is not a real treasure map, but a literary or religious document, perhaps a description of an ideal or imagined temple treasury, or a ritual text encoding sacred information in the form of a location list, or an eschatological document describing treasures to be revealed at the end of days. Others maintain that the treasure was real, that it represented the riches of the Jerusalem temple hidden before the Roman destruction of 70 CE, and that it simply has not yet been found, perhaps because the landmarks have changed beyond recognition, perhaps because it has been found and not reported, perhaps because it is still there, waiting under the ground of the Judean wilderness for the right combination of knowledge and luck and patience to bring it back into the light. The Copper Scroll is currently held at the Jordan Museum in Amman. Its strips of corroded copper are housed in their cases, its text translated and retranslated and debated and studied, its treasure unfound and perhaps unfindable. It is the ancient world's greatest open question, asked in a medium, metal rather than parchment, chosen specifically because it was meant to last. Someone made the deliberate decision to inscribe this list not on parchment, which might rot, not on pottery, which might shatter, but on copper, which endures. They wanted this to be read. They wanted the treasure to be found. Whether it ever will be, whether it can be, whether it exists to be found, is a question the Copper Scroll has been asking for 2,000 years, in the patient and enduring language of metal, to anyone willing to listen. The Mari prophetic texts. Along the banks of the Middle Euphrates River, in what is now eastern Syria, There once stood a city of considerable magnificence, a city of broad streets and whitewashed buildings, of a palace so large that it contained nearly 300 rooms and corridors, of archives and storerooms and throne rooms and courtyards that together formed one of the most impressive administrative complexes in the ancient Near East. The city was called Mari, and it flourished in the early 2nd millennium BCE before being conquered and burned by the Babylonian king Hammurabi around 1759 BCE. The fire that destroyed it baked the clay tablets in its archives hard enough to preserve them, and when French archaeologists began excavating the site in 1933, they found more than 20,000 cuneiform tablets waiting in the ruins of the palace, one of the largest and most significant archives ever discovered from the ancient world. Among the Mari tablets is a collection of texts that has drawn particular attention from scholars of the Hebrew Bible, a series of letters and reports describing the activities of prophetic figures in the Mari kingdom. These are individuals, some of them temple functionaries, some of them apparently ordinary people who received unsolicited divine communications, who delivered messages from the gods to the king, warning him of dangers, instructing him on ritual matters, demanding that he attend to the needs of the divine world. The messages were transmitted through a variety of means, through dreams, through ecstatic states, through the examination of omens. And they were delivered to the king in a form, the divine speech introduced by a messenger formula, the specific address to the ruler, the warning or instruction or demand, that is structurally very similar to the prophetic oracles of the Hebrew Bible. The Mari prophetic texts predate the biblical prophetic tradition by several centuries. They come from a different culture, a different language, a different pantheon of gods. And yet the phenomenon they describe, of a god communicating urgent messages to a human intermediary, who then transmits them to the king or to the community, is recognizably the same phenomenon that animates the books of Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah. Prophecy, the Mari tablets confirm, was not an Israelite invention. It was a feature of the religious landscape of the ancient Near East long before Israel existed as a nation. What the biblical prophets did with that tradition, the moral urgency they brought to it, the social criticism, the vision of history as the arena of divine action, was their own distinctive contribution. But the form itself, the channel through which that contribution flowed, was one they shared with the scribes and priests and dreamers of Mari, writing their letters on clay tablets in the palace on the Euphrates 3,500 years ago. The palace of Mari, even in its ruined state, has a grandeur that photographs convey only imperfectly. The throne room, where the king received ambassadors and officials and perhaps the nervous deliverers of divine messages, is large enough to feel imposing even now, stripped of its roof and its furnishings and its whitewash. The archives room, where the tablets were found stacked on their shelves, still shows the marks of the shelving in its walls. And the tablets themselves, housed now at the Louvre in Paris and at the National Museum in Damascus, carry in their cuneiform lines the voices of people who were trying to understand what the divine world required of the human one, in the same urgent and uncertain way that human beings have always tried to understand that question across every culture and every century that the world has known. The Lakish reliefs. In the British Museum in London, in a long gallery that wraps around 3 walls of a room, there is a series of carved stone panels that were once part of the decoration of the palace of the Assyrian king Sennacherib at Nineveh. They are large. Each panel is more than 2 meters high, and they were carved with extraordinary skill and detail sometime around 700 BC to commemorate one of the great military victories of Sennacherib's reign. What they depict is the Assyrian siege and capture of the Judean city of Lachish in 701 BC, the same city whose ostraca we have already visited, though those letters come from a century later and a different siege. The Lachish reliefs are among the most detailed and most carefully studied military narrative reliefs from the ancient world. They show the entire sequence of the siege in panoramic detail, the Assyrian army advancing toward the city, archers and slingers providing covering fire, siege engines, massive wheeled battering rams being pushed up earthen ramps toward the city walls, Judean defenders on the walls hurling firebrands down onto the siege engines, the city gates being breached, prisoners being led out in long columns, Judean soldiers being impaled on stakes as a warning to others, civilians fleeing with their possessions, and finally Sennacherib himself seated on his throne outside the city, receiving the submission of the surviving population while his scribes record the booty. The siege of Lachish is described in the biblical texts in the second book of Kings, in the second book of Chronicles, and in the book of Isaiah, as part of Sennacherib's broader campaign against Judah, a campaign that also included a siege of Jerusalem that, according to the biblical account, ended mysteriously when a catastrophic event, described as the angel of the Lord striking down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in the night, caused Sennacherib to withdraw without taking the city. Sennacherib's own account of the campaign, preserved in an inscription known as the Taylor Prism, confirms that he besieged Jerusalem and that Hezekiah paid him a heavy tribute, but does not claim to have captured the city, describing instead how he shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage. The two accounts agree that Jerusalem was not taken. They disagree, as one might expect, about why. The Lachish reliefs were discovered by the archaeologist Austin Henry Laird in the ruins of Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh in the 1840s and brought to the British Museum, where they have been displayed ever since. In the 1930s, British archaeologists excavating the site of ancient Lachish discovered the Assyrian siege ramp, a massive earthen structure still visible in the landscape of the site, and later excavations found arrowheads, sling stones, and armor scales at the base of the ramp, physical debris from the siege that the reliefs depict. The carved image of the siege ramp in the British Museum and the actual siege ramp still visible in the Israeli landscape are two perspectives on the same event, one artistic and royal and triumphant, one archaeological and silent, and simply there, the physical shape of a violent moment preserved in the earth of the Shephelah for 27 centuries. The Nag Hammadi Codex, too. Among the 13 codices discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, one is generally regarded by scholars as the most significant and the most studied, Codex II, which contains 7 texts, the most famous of which is the Gospel of Thomas, and the most provocative of which is a text called the Gospel of Philip. But there is another text in Codex II that deserves particular attention, both for its literary beauty and for the light it casts on the diversity of early Christian thought, the text known as the Apocryphon of John, or the Secret Book of John. The Apocryphon of John presents itself as a secret revelation given by the risen Jesus to the Apostle John, a revelation that unfolds a cosmology of extraordinary complexity, describing the ultimate divine reality, the tragic series of events that led to the creation of the material world, and the nature of the divine spark within human beings that seeks to return to its source. It is a text that reads, in places like a meditation and in other places like a myth, the two modes interweaving in the way that all great religious literature interweaves the personal and the cosmic, the intimate and the immense. The Apocryphon of John was not unknown before the Nag Hammadi discovery. Fragments of related texts had been found elsewhere, and Irenaeus of Lyon had ascribed its contents, disapprovingly, in the 2nd century CE. But the Nag Hammadi Codex provided the most complete and most carefully preserved version of the text, and its translation and publication open a window onto a form of early Christianity that the eventual orthodoxy had done its best to close. The Gnostic vision of the world, as a flawed creation produced by a lesser divine being, inhabited by sparks of divine light struggling toward reunion with the ultimate source, was deeply threatening to the emerging mainstream church, precisely because it was so compelling, so philosophically sophisticated, and so rooted in the same scriptures and the same apostolic traditions that the Orthodox also claimed. The Codex itself, the physical book, bound in leather, its papyrus pages covered in Coptic script, is one of the oldest surviving bound books in the world. The Codex form, pages bound together along one edge, was itself a relatively new technology in the 4th century CE, and the Nag Hammadi codices are among the finest early examples of it. Someone bound those pages with care. Someone stitched the leather cover. Someone placed the finished book in a jar and carried it to a cliff and buried it in the Egyptian sand. Those acts of preservation, whatever motivated them, whatever moment of danger or discretion or simple practicality prompted them, gave us a book that the intervening centuries would otherwise have consumed entirely. The care of unknown hands in an unknown moment has given us a voice that was meant to be silenced, speaking still, across 16 centuries of enforced quiet, in the warm, dry air of the Egyptian desert where it waited to be found. The Sidon sarcophagi. In the ancient Phoenician city of Sidon, on the coast of what is now Lebanon, a city mentioned multiple times in both the Old and New Testaments, a city that Jesus himself is described as visiting in the Gospel of Mark, there was discovered in 1887 a royal necropolis of extraordinary richness. The discovery was made by chance, when workers digging a well broke through into an underground chamber and found themselves in the presence of a collection of stone sarcophagi unlike anything that had been found before in the region. The Sidon sarcophagi, now housed in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, where they remain among the most prized objects in the collection, include 17 carved stone coffins spanning several centuries, from the 5th to the 2nd centuries BCE. They range from the simply carved to the spectacularly elaborate, and among them are two that have achieved particular fame in the history of ancient art. The mourning women's sarcophagus is decorated with figures of grieving women in high relief, carved with a naturalism and an emotional intensity that speaks of the influence of the great classical Greek sculptural tradition. The Phoenician patrons of Sidon were absorbing and adapting the artistic vocabulary of the wider Mediterranean world with remarkable sophistication. The weeping figures on its sides have a quality of genuine grief, of physical sorrow expressed through posture and gesture, that has moved viewers for more than 2,000 years. But the most famous of the Sidon sarcophagi is the one known as the Alexander sarcophagus, not because it is the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great himself, but because its carved panels depict Alexander the Great in battle and in the hunt, alongside a Phoenician or Persian figure who appears to be his ally. The sarcophagus was made for Abdolonymus, a man of royal lineage who had been living in poverty as a gardener when Alexander's conquest of the region in 332 BC restored him to the throne of Sidon. The carved scenes of the Battle of Issus, of a lion hunt in which Alexander and Abdolonymus hunt side by side, are rendered with a vibrancy and a detail that make them among the finest examples of narrative relief sculpture from the ancient world. The paint that originally colored the figures is partially preserved, and when its colors have been digitally reconstructed, the sarcophagus blazes with the reds and yellows and blues of a world that we are accustomed to seeing only in colorless stone. Sidon, the city where these kings were buried, the city whose purple dye and glass and cedar made it one of the great trading centers of the ancient world, appears in the biblical texts as a neighbor and sometimes an adversary of ancient Israel, as the homeland of Jezebel, as a city that Jesus visited, and where he healed the daughter of a Syro-Phoenician woman who argued with him and whose argument he honored. The sarcophagi of its kings lie in Istanbul, far from the coast where they were made, in a museum that was once the imperial treasury of the Ottoman Empire. And the city of Sidon still stands on its coastal promontory, inhabited continuously for more than 4,000 years, one of the oldest cities on earth, the sea moving against its shores as it always has, patient and indifferent and entirely unchanged. The Ekron Inscription. In 1996, archaeologists excavating the ancient Philistine city of Ekron, one of the 5 great cities of the Philistine Confederation described in the biblical texts, a city associated in the book of Samuel with the travels of the captured Ark of the Covenant, and in the book of Kings with the Philistine god Baal-zebub, found in the ruins of a large public building a royal dedicatory inscription carved in stone. It was intact, legible, and precisely datable, and it was immediately recognized as one of the most significant epigraphic discoveries ever made in Israel. The Ekron inscription, as it came to be known, is a 5-line text in Phoenician script, dedicating a temple to the goddess Pit-Gyh by a king named Akausu, son of Pottery, son of Yst, son of Ada, son of Yer, ruler of Ekron. The significance of this inscription for biblical scholarship is difficult to overstate. Pottery, the father of Akausu, appears by name in the annals of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. He is the king of Ekron whom Sennacherib describes rescuing from imprisonment by Hezekiah of Judah, who had taken him captive because he was loyal to Syria rather than to the anti-Assyrian coalition. Pottery also appears, very likely, in the Lachish reliefs as one of the Philistine rulers present at Sennacherib's court. And Ekron itself, the city, is mentioned by name in the inscription, providing the first ancient inscription ever found that explicitly identifies an archaeological site with a city named in the Bible. Here was a stone, found in a controlled excavation at a specific site, bearing the name of that site and the names of rulers who appear in both Assyrian royal annals and, by implication, in the biblical narrative of Sennacherib's campaign. 3 independent bodies of evidence, the Bible, the Assyrian annals, and the archaeological inscription, converging on the same people and the same events at the same moment in history. The city of Ekron is also significant for what its archaeology reveals about Philistine culture and economy. In the 7th century BCE, Ekron became one of the largest olive oil production centers in the ancient world. More than 100 olive oil presses have been found at the site, along with storage facilities capable of holding thousands of liters of oil. The Philistines, whom the biblical texts so often present as military adversaries and religious antagonists of ancient Israel, were also sophisticated economic actors, running what amounted to an industrial-scale food production operation that supplied olive oil across the region. The inscription that names their king and their goddess was found in a city that was, at the same time, a factory, and the combination of the sacred and the industrial, the royal dedication and the olive press, is a reminder that the ancient world, like every world, was more complicated and more interesting than any single story about it can fully capture. The Book of the Dead of Ani. In the great collection of the British Museum, among the most beautiful and most studied of all the Egyptian artifacts, there is a papyrus scroll of extraordinary length and richness, nearly 24 meters long, illustrated with vivid vignettes in red and black and gold and blue, written in hieratic script by a skilled scribe sometime around 1275 BC. It is called the Papyrus of Ani, and it is a copy of what Egyptologists call the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, prayers, and instructions intended to guide the soul of the deceased through the dangers of the afterlife and into the eternal presence of the gods. Ani was a royal scribe and accountant of the granaries of the lords of Abydos and Thebes, a man of considerable standing in the Egyptian bureaucratic world, prosperous enough to commission a particularly fine and lengthy version of the funerary text, illustrated with scenes of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. The papyrus was made specifically for him. His name is written into the blanks left in the standard text, personalizing it for his journey into the afterlife, making it his document, his guide, his companion in death. The Book of the Dead is relevant to the study of the biblical world not because it is a biblical text, it is emphatically not, but because it represents the Egyptian religious world against which the biblical texts so often define themselves, and because some of the themes and concerns it expresses resonate, in unexpected ways, with themes that appear in the Hebrew Bible. The most famous section of the Papyrus of Ani is the weighing of the heart scene. The dead man's heart is placed on one pan of a great scale, balanced against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and justice, on the other. If the heart is heavy with wrongdoing, it outweighs the feather and is devoured by the monstrous Ammit. If it is light, if the man has lived justly, it balances the feather, and the deceased is welcomed into the eternal presence of Osiris. The idea of a divine judgment in which the moral weight of a human life is assessed, in which the quality of how one has lived determines what comes after death, is one of the profound shared concerns of the ancient Near Eastern and biblical worlds. The Psalms describe God as a righteous judge who weighs the hearts of human beings. The Book of Proverbs declares that the Lord weighs the heart. The Book of Daniel describes a divine writing on the wall that announces a king has been weighed and found wanting. The specific imagery differs between the Egyptian and the biblical traditions. The underlying concern that human lives are morally accountable, that there is a standard against which they are measured, is a thread that runs through the whole ancient world, finding its expression in different forms and different mythologies, but always returning to the same fundamental question: how shall we live, and what becomes of us when we are gone. The Arch of Titus Menorah Panels Hidden Color. We have already visited the Arch of Titus and the relief panel depicting the menorah being carried through the streets of Rome in Titus's triumphal procession of 71 CE. But there is a further chapter to that story, one that unfolded not in the ancient world, but in a laboratory in the 21st century, and that added an unexpected layer of richness to an artifact that scholars had studied for nearly 2,000 years. In 2012, a team of researchers from the Yeshiva University Museum in New York and the University of Haifa began applying new imaging technologies to the Arch of Titus Menorah panel, technologies that could detect traces of pigment on stone surfaces that were invisible to the naked eye. What they found transformed the scholarly understanding of how the panel originally appeared. The menorah, which has always been seen as white marble, neutral, austere, timeless, was originally painted yellow, indicating that it was depicted as golden. The background of the panel was painted blue. Other elements showed traces of red and other colors. The triumphal procession, which 2,000 years of weathering had rendered in the monochrome of bare stone, was originally a vivid, colorful, almost theatrical scene, the golden menorah blazing against a blue background, carried through the streets of Rome in all its gilded splendor. This discovery matters for reasons that extend beyond the purely aesthetic. The color yellow, indicating gold, on the menorah panel is evidence that the carvers and the painters of the Arch of Titus were attempting to represent the actual appearance of the temple menorah as accurately as they could. They were not simply producing a generic representation of a lampstand. They were depicting a specific object, a real object, that had been carried through the streets of Rome a decade earlier and that some of their viewers may well have seen with their own eyes. The painted arch panel is thus a more reliable witness to the appearance of the temple menorah than the unpainted version had seemed, its colors carrying information about the actual object, not just its symbolic significance. The discovery also serves as a reminder of how much of the ancient world we have been seeing incorrectly, or rather incompletely. The temples and sculptures and monuments of antiquity that we know as white marble were, almost without exception, originally brightly painted. The Parthenon was painted. The sculptures of Phidias were painted. The triumphal arches of Rome were painted. The ancient world was not the austere, monochromatic landscape that centuries of weathering have made it appear. It was vivid, bright, emphatic, a world that announced its meanings in color as well as form, that communicated through the full range of the visual spectrum that would look, to our eyes, startlingly different from the bleached and beautiful ruins we have come to associate with antiquity. The painted menorah on the Arch of Titus is a small window into that lost color, a glimpse of what the ancient world actually looked like before the paint faded and the centuries turned everything to stone. The Gezer water system. Beneath the ancient mound of Gezer, the city that has already given us its agricultural calendar, its standing stones, its inscribed seal impressions, there is yet another remarkable survival from the ancient world, a water system of considerable engineering sophistication, carved through solid rock to a depth of more than 14 meters, providing access to a freshwater spring that lay below the level of the city's foundations. The Gezer water system consists of a large stepped shaft cut vertically through the rock, with a tunnel leading horizontally from the bottom of the shaft to the spring. It was excavated by the Hebrew Union College Archaeological School beginning in the 1960s, and it was dated to the Late Bronze Age, approximately the 14th or 13th century BC, making it one of the oldest such water systems yet discovered in ancient Canaan. It belongs to a family of underground water systems at Megiddo, at Hazor, at Jerusalem, at Lachish, that represent one of the most impressive achievements of ancient Israelite and Canaanite engineering, the systematic effort to secure a city's water supply within its walls against the possibility of siege. The experience of descending into the Gezer water system, as archaeologists and visitors have done, is one of those moments when the distance between the present and the ancient past collapses in an unexpected way. The steps are worn smooth by the feet of 3,000 years of use. The walls of the shaft still show the marks of the iron tools that cut them. The air at the bottom is cool and damp in a way that the dry Israeli landscape above makes feel almost miraculous. Someone stood at this same bottom, in this same cool dark, filling a vessel from the same spring, 3,000 years ago. The continuity is physical, immediate, and quietly overwhelming. Gezer itself appears in the biblical texts as a city of considerable strategic importance. It guarded the approach to Jerusalem from the coastal plain, and its conquest is described in both the Book of Joshua and the Book of Kings. The Egyptian pharaoh gave it as a dowry to his daughter when she married Solomon. According to the first Book of Kings, one of the few instances in the biblical text of an Egyptian pharaoh giving a Canaanite city to an Israelite king as a marriage gift. The archaeological record at Gezer includes a destruction layer consistent with Egyptian military activity in the 10th century BCE, and the gate complex built there in the Iron Age has been compared to gates at Megiddo and Hazor that the biblical text associates with Solomon's building activities. The city that produced the oldest Hebrew calendar, the most beautiful ancient seal of a royal servant, the oldest high place of standing stones, and the oldest water system in ancient Canaan is a site of extraordinary density, a place where the material culture of the ancient world accumulated across centuries of continuous occupation, layer upon layer, each one preserving something that the next built upon and eventually covered over. The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III. In the British Museum, in the same gallery that houses the Lachish reliefs and other Assyrian monuments, there stands a black limestone obelisk nearly 2 meters tall, carved on all four sides with relief panels depicting the tribute being brought to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III by the rulers of various conquered or subject peoples. It was found at Nimrud, the ancient Assyrian capital Calhu, by Austin Henry Layard in 1846, and it dates to approximately 825 BCE. It is called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, and one of the figures depicted on it has made it one of the most discussed artifacts in the entire corpus of biblical archaeology. In the second register of panels on the obelisk, a figure is shown prostrating himself before the Assyrian king, lying flat on the ground, face to the earth, in the posture of complete submission. The cuneiform inscription above the scene identifies the prostrate figure as Iua, son of Humri, a name and a patronymic that most scholars identify as a rendering in Assyrian cuneiform of Jehu, son of Omri. Jehu appears prominently in the second Book of Kings as the military commander who overthrew the dynasty of Ahab and Jezebel in a bloody coup, killed the kings of both Israel and Judah, and established his own dynasty on the throne of the northern kingdom. The patronymic son of Omri does not mean that Jehu was literally the son of Omri. He was not, and the biblical text makes no such claim, but rather that he was identified by the Assyrians as a ruler of the kingdom that Omri had founded, the kingdom that Assyrian records consistently refer to as the House of Omri, regardless of which dynasty was actually ruling. If the identification is correct, and it is widely, though not universally, accepted, then the prostrate figure on the black obelisk is the only image of a biblical king ever found in an ancient inscription. Jehu, son of Omri, faced to the ground before the Assyrian king, the same Jehu who in the biblical account was anointed king of Israel by a prophet of God, who drove his chariot furiously through the streets of Jezreel, who threw Jezebel from her window and left her body to be eaten by dogs, who executed the 70 sons of Ahab and piled their heads in baskets at the city gate. That figure, violent, driven, chosen, is here rendered in stone as a suppliant, face to the earth, paying tribute to a foreign king. History rarely offers a more complete illustration of the distance between the stories we tell about ourselves and the stories others tell about us, between the self-image of a king and the image carved of him by his enemies, between the triumphant narrative of divine election and the quiet, implacable testimony of stone. The Ethiopian Kebra Nagast. We close this portion of our journey not with an artifact of stone or clay or parchment in the conventional archaeological sense, but with a text, a manuscript tradition, a living document that has been copied and recopied across centuries and that continues to shape the religious identity of an entire nation. The Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, is the national epic of Ethiopia, a text that claims to record the origins of the Ethiopian royal dynasty and its connection to the biblical tradition, and that has been central to Ethiopian Christianity and Ethiopian national identity for more than 1,000 years. The Kebra Nagast tells the story of the Queen of Sheba, called Makeda in the Ethiopian tradition, her legendary visit to King Solomon in Jerusalem, her return to Ethiopia, and the birth of her son Menelik, who grows up and travels to Jerusalem to meet his father Solomon. Solomon recognizes and loves his son, and when Menelik returns to Ethiopia, he takes with him, secretly, without Solomon's knowledge, carried by the firstborn sons of the Israelite priests who accompany him, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark comes to rest in Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian royal dynasty that descends from Menelik is understood as the legitimate continuation of the Solomonic line, the true heirs of the covenant, the chosen people of God in the age after the Ark's departure from Jerusalem. The Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon is described in both the first book of Kings and the second book of Chronicles, a brief account, tantalizing in its compression, that has generated an enormous secondary literature of legend and interpretation across Jewish, Christian, Islamic, and Ethiopian traditions. The Kebra Nagast, in its Ethiopian form, represents the most elaborate and the most politically consequential of those interpretive traditions, a text that was used for centuries to legitimize the Ethiopian royal dynasty by tracing its lineage directly to Solomon, that was central to the religious identity of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and that was a source of profound inspiration to the Rastafari movement of the 20th century, which drew on its account of Ethiopian royal lineage and its vision of Ethiopia as the true Zion. The oldest surviving manuscripts of the Kebra Nagast date to the 14th century CE, though the text is generally believed to be older, perhaps compiled in its current form in the 13th or 14th century from older sources, oral and written, that reached back into the early centuries of Ethiopian Christianity. The manuscript tradition is rich and varied, with copies held in libraries and monasteries across Ethiopia, in the British Library in London, in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, and in other collections around the world. Each copy is slightly different. The text was living, evolving, being adapted to the needs of the communities that copied and used it, and the differences between manuscripts are themselves a form of evidence about the history of Ethiopian Christianity and the changing political contexts in which the text was read and interpreted. The Keber Nagast is not an archaeological artifact in the way that the Cyrus cylinder or the Mesha stele are artifacts. It is a text, a story, a vision of history, one people's account of their own origins and their own relationship to the biblical tradition, told with the confidence and the beauty of a culture that has been living with these stories for 2,000 years. But it belongs in this journey because it represents something that all of the artifacts we have visited represent in their various ways: the human need to connect the present to the sacred past, to find in the ancient stories a thread that leads directly to here and now and us, to say, across the distance of centuries and the strangeness of time, that we are part of this story, that we have always been part of this story, that the story is not finished and we are its continuation. That impulse to connect, to remember, to claim kinship with the ancient and the sacred is not the exclusive property of any one tradition or any one people. It is one of the most universal and most deeply human things there is. The scribes of Qumran felt it when they copied their scrolls by lamplight in the desert. The soldier at Lachish felt it when he watched for fire signals in the dark. The woman who wore the silver amulet with a priestly blessing felt it against her skin. The Ethiopian monk who copies the Keber Nagast in a monastery on a high plateau feels it today. And we, who have traveled through all of these artifacts and all of these stories in the quiet of this long and gentle journey, feel something of it too. The sense that these ancient things are not merely old, not merely interesting, not merely historical. They are ours. They belong to the long human story that we are still, in this very moment, living and telling and passing forward into a future that cannot yet be seen. The Gezer boundary inscriptions. There is something quietly moving about a boundary marker, about the human impulse to say, in stone or wood or paint or ink, that here is where one thing ends and another begins, that this line matters, that the ground on this side is different from the ground on that side, and that whoever comes after should know it. Boundary markers are among the most ancient of all human artifacts, and they speak of a world organized into territories and responsibilities and relationships that their makers considered important enough to record in permanent form. At the site of ancient Gezer, a city that has given us so much already in this long journey, from its agricultural calendar to its standing stones to its water system, archaeologists have found a series of inscribed stones that served as boundary markers for the city's territory in the Second Temple period. The Gezer boundary inscriptions are carved in Hebrew, and they read simply, "The boundary of Gezer." They were placed at intervals around the perimeter of the city's agricultural land, marking the extent of the territory that belonged to the community of Gezer, the fields and orchards and pastures that sustained the people who lived within the city's walls. The inscriptions date to approximately the 1st century BCE or the 1st century CE, and they are written in a Hebrew that is already beginning to show the influence of the late Second Temple period's linguistic changes. They are not grand inscriptions. They do not commemorate a king or a battle or a divine event. They record something far more ordinary, the agreed limits of a community's land, And in that ordinariness, they speak of a world of farmers and herders and olive growers who needed to know where their land ended and their neighbors began, who planted and harvested within the boundaries that those stones marked, who lived their entire lives within a territory small enough that you could walk its perimeter in a day. The city of Gezer appears in the biblical texts across many centuries and many contexts, in the conquest narratives of the Book of Joshua, in the administrative lists of the Book of Kings, in the books of the Maccabees where it appears as a strategic fortress. Its boundary inscriptions are a document from one of the quieter moments of that long history, not a moment of conquest or crisis, but a moment of settled community life, of agricultural routine, of people who had been living in the same place long enough to need permanent markers of where their land ended. There is a peace in that, a sense of rootedness and continuity that the more dramatic moments of biblical history can sometimes obscure. The stones that marked the boundary of Gezer are the stones of a people who intended to stay. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this journey through the ancient biblical world as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. We've only scratched the surface, though. Part 2 is coming, and trust me, there is so much more to discover. If you enjoyed this one, please give it a like and hit subscribe so you don't miss part 2 when it drops. It really means the world to me. See you in the next one.